Hey you. Yes, you the one who just got comfortable, maybe pulled the blanket a little higher, maybe turned the lights down low. Welcome back. I am really glad you are here tonight. Now, before we begin, I have to warn you. What I am about to tell you is one of those stories that starts with a 6-year-old girl being carried across a room and ends with something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about power love and what it actually meant to be born a princess. So stay with me, because this one is going to stay with you. Picture this, the year is 1496. The place is a grand pavilion on the border between France and England, and in the middle of all the silk banners and trumpets and men in armour bowing low, there is a little girl. She's 6 years old. Her name is Isabella. She's wearing a blue velvet dress sewn with golden flowers, and she's clutching a doll. She's been told very carefully by the adults in her life that today she's going to become a queen, that she's going to be the most important lady in all of England, that she should be proud, that she should smile, so she smiles. 2 grown men, the Dukes of Berry and Burgundy, physically lift her up and carry her across the room to the man waiting on the other side. He is 29 years old. He is a widower. He is the King of England, Richard II, and Isabella of Valois, age 6, is about to become his wife. She brought her dolls with her to England. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not to judge it. Not yet. But just to feel the full weight of it. A child. With her dolls. Stepping into a crown. Now, if you are settling in for the night and this kind of story is exactly what you came here for, welcome. If this is your first time here, this channel is a place where we slow down, go deep, and ask the questions most people walk right past. And if you have been here before, you already know what we do. If tonight's story is speaking to you, take just a second to tap like and subscribe. Not because I am nudging you, but because it genuinely helps me keep bringing stories like this to you, night after night. And I would love it if you dropped a comment telling me where in the world you're watching this from right now. People have told me they tune in from Japan at 2 in the morning from Texas, during a thunderstorm from London on a lunch break. Every single one of those little details makes this feel real to me. So tell me, I read everything. All right, lights low, fan on, let us begin. The story of young royal brides is one of the most misunderstood chapters in all of history. And I say misunderstood not because people do not know it happened, they do. Most people have at least heard that girls were married off young in the old days, but what most people do not know is why, how, and what actually happened to those girls after the wedding was over. Because it was not simple, it was not one thing. It was a system, a massive, complicated, centuries-old system where daughters were the most valuable currency a king could hold. Not because anyone was necessarily cruel, though sometimes they were, but because in a world without international law, without diplomacy as we know it today, without any way to guarantee peace between 2 kingdoms except through a shared bloodline, a daughter was a treaty. A living, breathing, walking peace agreement. And you wanted to lock in that agreement as early as possible, before the other side changed their mind. Think about how fragile everything was. 2 kingdoms, 2 kings separated by mountains or ocean or language with armies, always just one bad harvest away from turning on each other. How do you guarantee that France and England will not go to war again? You make the King of France's daughter the Queen of England. You make their children half French, half English. You make war feel like attacking your own family. That was the logic. Cold, calculated, and breathtakingly human. And the younger the bride when she arrived, the better, because a young girl could be shaped. She could learn the new language. She could grow up loyal to her new country rather than her old one. She would know no other life. She would not arrive with her own political alliances, her own dangerous ideas about power. She would arrive like a blank page, and they would write her story for her. Now here is something that genuinely surprised me when I first learned it, and I think it might surprise you too. Most of these child marriages, especially among royalty, were not what you are imagining right now. There was a canon law, meaning church law, that set the official minimum age of 12 for girls and 14 for boys before a marriage could be consummated. And many royal marriages of very young children were understood openly and formally to be political arrangements only. The actual marriage in the full physical sense would wait. Isabella of Valois, the little girl I told you about at the beginning, she was married to Richard II at age 6, but she was never expected to be his wife in any full sense at that age. She lived in Windsor Castle with her own household, her own ladies, her own tutors. Richard visited her with what historians describe as quiet affection. He called her his dear heart. He gave her gifts. He was reportedly gentle with her, more like a doting father figure than a husband. And then he was overthrown, murdered. She was 12 years old and suddenly a widow. The marriage was never consummated, not once. A childhood spent preparing to be queen, and then the whole thing dissolved around her like smoke. What happened to her after, we'll get to that, and I promise it is not the ending you expect. But I want you to hold that image for now. A 12-year-old girl, a widow, a political pawn whose entire childhood had been organized around a purpose that was now simply cancelled. Think about what that does to a person. Because here is the thing about this history that I keep coming back to. These were not statistics. They were not names on a treaty. They were children. They packed their toys. They cried when they said goodbye to their mothers. Some of them wrote letters home for years in languages they were still learning, asking about their sisters and their dogs, and whether the garden back home was still blooming. Margaret Tudor, 13 years old. The older sister of the man who had become Henry VIII was sent to Scotland in 1503 to marry King James IV. He was 29. She rode north in a procession that took weeks waving from her horse at crowds of strangers who were now apparently her people. She did not speak Scottish. She barely knew her new husband. She had packed her favourite dresses, her prayer books, her jewellery, and she sat in a foreign castle and tried to become a queen. She was 13. Now, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, Margaret Tudor did not crumble. Over time, she became one of the most politically sharp women in all of Europe. A woman who survived widowhood, remarriage, scandal and war. She used every tool available to her. She manoeuvred, she negotiated, she outlasted people who underestimated her. But she should not have had to do any of that starting at age 13. That is the other thing I keep turning over in my mind. She was brilliant. She was resilient. Imagine what she might have done if she had simply been given a choice, and that tension between the extraordinary strength of these women and the impossible circumstances they were placed in through no fault of their own. That is what this entire series is really about. Tonight we started with a door opening. A 6-year-old girl in a blue dress being carried across a room full of powerful men. She could not have known in that moment what was coming. That she would be widowed before she was 13. That 2 kings would argue over her future like she was furniture. That she would eventually return to France to start all over again. She just knew she was supposed to smile. So, she smiled. In the parts ahead, we're going to go much deeper. We're going to look at the actual machinery behind these marriages, the negotiations, the dowries, the cold economics of a daughter's hand. We're going to meet the brides who found unexpected strength, and the ones who were simply consumed by the system. We're going to uncover something that might completely change how you picture medieval marriage, because the truth is far more layered and far more fascinating than anything you have been told. And we're going to sit with the real question underneath all of it. What did this actually cost these girls? Not in history books, not in treaties. but in the quiet, personal, irreplaceable things that cannot be returned. The next part of our story begins where every royal marriage truly started not in a chapel, not in a gown, but in a negotiating room, with men talking numbers, and a daughter's future being arranged like a piece of real estate. Stay with me. There is a phrase in Latin, old elegant and quietly devastating, that the House of Habsburg made famous somewhere around the 15th and 16th centuries. It goes like this: Bella gerant alitu Felix Austria nube, which translated into plain English means, let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. Say that again slowly. Let others wage war, you marry. That was not a joke. That was not a motto on a greeting card. That was the actual foreign policy of one of the most powerful dynasties in the history of Europe. And it worked so extraordinarily well that within a few generations the Habsburgs through marriage alone had assembled an empire stretching from Austria to Spain to Burgundy to the New World. No army, no conquest, just daughters, just wedding contracts, just girls handed off at the right moment to the right man. When you understand that, you start to understand everything else we're going to talk about tonight. Because part one gave you the image, the little girl in the blue dress, the doll, the crown. But part two is where we pull back the curtain and look at the machinery. The cold, meticulous, almost mathematical system that made these weddings happen. The men in the room before the ceremony, the numbers on the table, the calculating logic that turned a 6-year-old child into a diplomatic instrument. And honestly, once you see how the machine worked, it is somehow both more horrifying and more understandable than you expected. Let us start with the negotiating table, because that is where every royal marriage actually began. Not in a chapel, not with a courtship, not with a letter written in candlelight by a lovesick prince. It started months, sometimes years earlier, in a room full of ambassadors, lawyers and advisors, all seated around a long table covered in documents. And those documents were not about feelings, they were about land, about money, about castles and fortresses and trading rights and claims to disputed territories that would not be resolved for another generation. A royal marriage negotiation in medieval Europe was at its core a real estate transaction, and the bride was part of the inventory. Here is how it worked. Every bride brought something to the marriage called a dowry, a transfer of wealth from her family to her new husband's household. This could be cash, it could be jewels, it could be entire territories changing hands. When Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England in 1662, her dowry included the city of Tangier, the port of Bombay, which later became Mumbai, and £300,000 in cash. £300,000 in the 17th century. That is roughly the equivalent of billions of dollars today. Catherine was not just a bride. She was a transaction that rewrote trade routes. And think about what the groom's side owed in return. Something called a jointure, a guaranteed income or property portfolio set aside for the wife in case she was widowed. This was in theory her financial safety net, her protection. Because everyone at that table understood very clearly that young brides had a habit of becoming young widows. And a widow with no jointure was a political problem for everyone. So before anyone said a single word about the wedding itself, about the dress, the feast, the ceremony, those numbers had to be settled. What does she bring? What does he guarantee in return? What happens to the children? Who controls what territory if the king dies? What if there are no children? These negotiations could take years. Whole teams of professional marriage brokers move between courts like chess pieces, carrying proposals and counter-proposals. Some of these brokers were trusted noblemen, some were church officials, some were essentially professional matchmakers who had turned diplomatic marriage into a full-time career, men who knew the genealogy of every major royal house in Europe, who had standing relationships with half a dozen courts, and who understood exactly what price was appropriate for which alliance. Do you ever stop and think about the fact that there were people in medieval Europe whose entire professional identity was arranging marriages for children they had never met? I find that both fascinating and slightly unsettling. But there it is. Now let me show you why all of this mattered so much. And to do that, I want to take you to a specific moment, a single marriage treaty that most people have never heard of, but that quietly changed the shape of European history. The year is 1496, Emperor Maximilian I. The man most associated with the Habsburg marriage policy has a son named Philip, and he arranges for Philip to marry a Spanish princess named Joanna, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile and Aragon. You might know them as the monarchs who funded Christopher Columbus. Philip and Joanna are married, they have children, and then one by one the unexpected starts happening. Joanna's older brother dies with no heir. Her older sister dies with no heir. Suddenly, Joanna, who was never meant to inherit anything at all, who was married off specifically because her older siblings were supposed to carry the dynasty, becomes the heiress to the entire Spanish throne. Her husband Philip dies young, and their son Charles inherits everything: Spain, Austria, Burgundy, Naples, the Americas, the Philippines. One marriage. One contract signed in a room full of negotiators talking about land and money. And the result was the largest empire the Western world had seen in over 1,000 years. That is not an accident of history. That is the marriage system working exactly as designed. A daughter placed at the right table at the right moment, and the pieces fall into place across generations. The Habsburg dynasty literally built a world empire by marrying their children at the right time to the right people in the right order. And when I say children, I do mean children. Philip the Fair was arranged to his Spanish bride when negotiations between the families were still ongoing. Joanna herself was not yet 17 when she left Spain to become a bride in a foreign country. But here is the question I want you to sit with, because I think it is more interesting than any of the politics. What did those girls know? What were they told? Did they understand on any level what they were actually part of? And the answer is yes, most of them did. That's perhaps the most complex part of this story. Royal daughters were not kept ignorant of their purpose. From the time they were very young, they were trained to understand it, educated to embrace it. They were taught languages, multiple languages, so they could function in foreign courts. They were taught music deportment, the management of a large household, the protocols of foreign courts, the histories of the families they might one day marry into. In the court of Spain in the late 1400s, royal daughters were educated with striking rigour. History, philosophy, Latin, music, governance. Not because anyone thought they needed an education for its own sake, but because a well-educated princess was a more valuable diplomatic asset. A girl who could converse intelligently with a foreign king, who could write gracious letters in 3 languages, who understood the political landscape she was being placed into. She was worth more at the negotiating table than a girl who could only smile and dance. They were prepared. And in being prepared, many of them understood on some level exactly what they were being prepared for. I think about that sometimes. The strange, uncomfortable dignity of it. These girls were not treated as ignorant. They were treated as important. They were taught to see themselves as carrying the weight of something larger than themselves: dynasty, faith, peace, the survival of their family name. They were given a story that made their sacrifice meaningful. Whether that story was true is a different question entirely. There is one more part of this machinery I want to show you before we move on, because I think it explains something that confuses a lot of people about this history. Why did families agree to send their daughters so young? If you knew your 12-year-old was going to a foreign court, possibly never to return, why would you do it? And the honest answer is because the earlier you sent her, the safer the alliance. A young girl who arrived in a foreign court at age 12 or 13 and spent her adolescence there would grow up loyal to that court. She would speak the language fluently. She would have friends there, relationships there, memories there. She would in a very real sense belong there. She would not arrive at 30 with established loyalties elsewhere, with political opinions formed by her birth country, with an agenda that might contradict her husband's interests. She arrived like, as I said last time, a blank page, and they wrote her story for her. The younger she arrived, the more completely she could be shaped. That was not cruelty in the minds of the people making these decisions. That was strategy. That was, by the logic of the time, actually kinder, because it meant the girl would adapt more easily, suffer less from homesickness, find it easier to build a life in her new country. I am not saying that logic was right. I am saying it was genuinely believed, and here is the thing about that belief: it was not entirely wrong. The girls who arrived young and who were treated well genuinely did adapt. They did build lives. Some of them built extraordinary lives. That is a thread we're going to follow much more closely as this series goes on. But there is something else that belief erased, something it refused to account for. And that is the question of what the girl herself wanted, what she felt, what she feared, what she left behind in that first home that she never quite stopped missing, even decades later. The system was built to produce results at scale, and it did. Empires rose and fell on the outcomes of these negotiations. Wars were prevented, dynasties were cemented, continents changed hands, but the cost of all of that, the real human irreducible cost, was paid by the people who had no seat at the table, where their futures were being decided. And in the next part of this story, we're going to follow one of those girls on the actual journey, the weeks-long, terrifying, life-altering journey, from everything she knew to a life she had never chosen. Because the wedding day was never the beginning of the story. It was what came before and what came after that tells you who these women really were. Stay with me. Close your eyes for a second. Just for a second. You're 15 years old. You've just said goodbye to your mother at the edge of a city you've known your whole life. She's standing there in the dust watching you go. You turn around once, maybe twice, and then you face forward, because facing forward is the only thing left to do. You will never see her again. That is not a metaphor. That is not a dramatic flourish. That is simply what happened to Catherine of Aragon in the summer of 1501, when she said goodbye to her parents at the edge of Granada, a city she had grown up in, a palace she had called home, and set off on a 500-mile journey across Spain to reach a harbour where a ship was waiting to take her to England. Her mother, Queen Isabella of Castile, one of the most powerful women in the history of the world, watched her youngest daughter ride away. And then Catherine turned a corner and Spain disappeared behind her. She was 15. She'd been promised to England since she was 3 years old. She'd spent her entire childhood preparing for this moment, and now the moment had come, and it was nothing like anything you could prepare for. This is part 3. And this is the story of the journey itself, because here is something that gets lost in the politics and the treaties and the dowry negotiations we talked about last time. Getting to the wedding was not simple. It was not a matter of packing a trunk and stepping into a carriage. For most of these young brides, the journey to their new country was one of the most dangerous, exhausting, and disorienting experiences of their lives, and they had to do it at an age when most of us were still figuring out who we were. Catherine's trip to England in 1501 is a perfect example. She left Granada in late May, travelling north through the mountains toward the coast. The heat was brutal. Late spring in southern Spain is no gentle thing, and her enormous entourage of ladies' servants, horses, and luggage had to cross serious terrain to reach the northern harbour. Her first attempt to sail was made in August, and it failed immediately. A violent storm in the Bay of Biscay, one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the Atlantic, drove her ships back to Spain. They turned around. They waited. They tried again in late September, The second crossing took 6 days. The sea was rough, the ships rolled, and Catherine of Aragon, a princess who had grown up in the sun-baked luxury of the Alhambra Palace, who'd never been on open water in her life, sat in a pitching cabin, somewhere over the Bay of Biscay, and waited to find out whether she would arrive in England or at the bottom of the sea. She arrived at Plymouth on the 2nd of October 1501. She'd been travelling for months. She was exhausted, seasick, far from home, and she did not speak a single word of English. The crowds who came out to greet her apparently went absolutely wild. Her doctor, who was travelling with her, wrote that she could not have been received with greater rejoicings if she had been the saviour of the world. People lined the streets. There were celebrations, music cheering. England was delighted to have its Spanish princess. And Catherine, who had just spent months on a gruelling overland journey followed by a terrifying sea crossing, had to smile and wave and be gracious and meet the crowd, because that was her job now. That was who she was. She was the Spanish princess. She was the alliance. She was the treaty made flesh. She did not get to just be tired. Now I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think about this a lot. When you imagine a royal bride's journey, what do you picture? Flowers, a golden carriage, ladies in waiting adjusting her hair while she gazes serenely out the window. Maybe. Sometimes. But the reality for most of these women was so much more complicated than that image. The journey was not just physically difficult, it was psychologically radical. It was the moment when one life ended and another began, whether you were ready or not. And no story illustrates that more vividly than what happened to Marie Antoinette in the spring of 1770. She was 14 years old when she left Vienna on the 21st of April 1770. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, a woman who had managed one of the most powerful empires in Europe while raising 16 children, and who had spent years meticulously planning this particular marriage, stood at the door and watched her youngest daughter climb into a carriage. She reportedly wept. She told Marie Antoinette, "Farewell, my dearest. Do so much good to the French people that they can say that I have sent them an angel." I have to believe Maria Theresa meant that sincerely. And I also believe that sending a 14-year-old girl alone to Versailles, whatever she hoped for her, was something she must have wrestled with. She was not a cold woman. She was a calculated one. Those are different things. The journey from Vienna to the French border took weeks. Marie Antoinette travelled in a procession of nearly 60 carriages, an enormous, elaborate moving household, passing through Munich, through Freiburg, stopping at inns and palaces along the way. People came out of towns just to catch a glimpse of her. She was by all accounts strikingly pretty with pale skin, and the kind of composed presence that had been drilled into her since childhood. But on the 7th of May, just over 2 weeks after leaving home, the procession stopped on a small island in the middle of the Rhine River. And here is where the journey became something else entirely. On that island, the French and Austrian courts had erected a specially built pavilion, a grand room divided down the middle by a long table covered in red velvet. That table represented the border. On one side, Austria, on the other, France. And the ceremony that took place there was one of the strangest, most revealing rituals in the entire history of royal marriages. Marie Antoinette walked into the Austrian side of that room, and then piece by piece everything Austrian was removed from her. Her clothes, her jewellery, her personal belongings, her servants, her ladies-in-waiting who had known her since childhood. And then this detail always gets me, her dog. A small pug named Mops, who she had brought from Vienna because she loved him. He was taken from her arms on that island and given back to the Austrian side. She could not take the dog across the border. The dog was Austrian, and she was no longer Austrian. She was French now. She crossed to the other side of the red velvet table, in nothing, quite literally nothing, according to some accounts of the ceremony, and was then dressed from scratch in French clothes by French ladies according to French fashion. She emerged from that pavilion not as the Archduchess Maria Antonia of Austria, but as Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. She was 14 years old. She had just crossed a symbolic border that separated her from every single thing she had known about herself. I do not think she cried. She was too well trained to cry in public. But I wonder what happened in the quiet moments after, in the carriage in the dark when no one was watching and she had no dog to hold. The thing about these journeys that I find so historically significant beyond the personal emotional weight is what they reveal about how these girls were understood by the world around them. Marie Antoinette's transformation on that Rhine island was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was theatrical. The whole point was to perform publicly and completely the erasure of one identity and the creation of another. The bride was to arrive in her new country without anything that might remind her or anyone else of where she came from. She was to be a blank page. We talked about that last time in a political sense. But here on that island you could see it happening in real time. Literally. The clothes off her back, the dog from her arms, the servant she had known her whole life left standing on the Austrian side of a red velvet table while she walked away. That is not just diplomacy. That is transformation as a spectacle. And the person being transformed had no say in it whatsoever. Now contrast that with Catherine of Aragon's experience in England. Catherine was actually allowed to keep much more of her Spanish household around her, her ladies, her servants, even her language for a time. Her parents had negotiated this specifically. Isabella of Castile, who knew exactly what it felt like to be a girl navigating a world of men with agendas, had insisted that her daughter not be entirely stripped of her identity when she crossed into England. It was a small act of maternal protection within a system that gave mothers very little to protect with. But it mattered. Catherine of Aragon kept her Spanish ladies for years. They were her anchor, her continuity, her evidence that she had existed before England. The contrast between these two women's journeys tells you something important about the range of experience within this system. It was not one monolithic thing. Some families pushed harder for their daughters, some courts were kinder than others, some brides arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, new clothes, foreign clothes chosen by strangers. Others arrived with a small piece of home still intact, but they all arrived having left something behind that they could never fully recover. There is one more piece of this journey I want to sit with before we move on, because I think it is the most quietly devastating detail of all. When Catherine of Aragon arrived in England and travelled toward London for her formal entry in November of 1501, she still had not met her future husband. She had been betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, since she was 3 years old. She had exchanged letters with him, formal, careful letters written in Latin, the only language they had in common. She knew what he looked like from a portrait that had been sent to Spain, but she'd never heard his voice, never sat in the same room with him, never had a single conversation that was not mediated by ambassadors and translators and the careful choreography of 2 royal courts trying to manage an alliance. And when they finally did meet at Dogmersfield in Hampshire, just over a month after she landed, the meeting had to be forced. Catherine's Spanish household had strict orders from her parents not to allow Arthur to see her before the wedding. That was the protocol. That was the tradition. A bride remained veiled and unseen until the ceremony itself, but young King Henry VII, apparently charmed by the whole situation, and frankly just curious, rode to Dogmersfield himself and basically demanded to meet her early protocols be damned. He wanted to see the girl England had been paying for and waiting for and politically manoeuvring around for 12 years. Catherine came out. She and Arthur exchanged a few careful words, and that a brief, awkward, chaperoned conversation between 2 teenagers who did not speak each other's language overseen by their respective households and a king who had technically crashed the introduction was the courtship. That was all the time they had before the wedding. When you think about it that way, the wedding itself becomes almost beside the point. The real story, the real weight, was everything that happened before it. The years of planning, the months of travel, the moment of transformation at a border, the first stilted conversation with a stranger who was about to become your husband. These girls did not fall in love and then get married. They arrived, they met, and then they began the long, complicated, often painful work of building a life out of what they had been given. Which brings us to the next part of the story, because once the journey ended and the wedding was over, the real challenge began. And it was more dangerous than any sea crossing, more demanding than any journey across a mountain range in the August heat, because a young bride's first duty in her new country was not to settle in, or to get to know her husband, or to grieve what she had left behind. Her first duty was to provide an heir. And what that meant for these young women's bodies and minds, that is what we turn to next. Of all the things we've covered so far, the negotiations, the dowry tables, the border ceremonies, the sea crossings through storms, there is one chapter of this history that gets almost no attention at all. The waiting. Not the journey to the wedding. Not the wedding itself. But the years, sometimes many years, between the moment a girl's future was officially decided and the moment she actually had to live inside it. The strange suspended time when a child was already betrothed, already technically spoken for, already written into someone else's dynastic calculations, but still for a while longer herself. Let me show you just how young that moment of deciding could come. Mary Queen of Scots was 6 months old when the first marriage agreement was signed for her. 6 months old. She was not yet sitting up on her own. She was not yet forming words. She was in every meaningful sense a newborn, a tiny girl wrapped in swaddling clothes in Stirling Castle, while the adults around her negotiated her future with the same energy and focus they would have applied to a treaty between armies. The year was 1543. Henry VIII of England wanted her for his son Edward, who was himself 6 years old at the time. The plan was elegant in its ambition. Mary would grow up, marry Edward, and the two kingdoms of England and Scotland, which had been fighting each other for centuries, would be united through their children. One baby girl, 6 months into her life, was supposed to settle a conflict that had consumed generations. The deal fell apart almost immediately, as these deals so often did. Scotland's Catholic noblemen were not interested in a Protestant-English alliance. They tore up the treaty, sent Mary to France instead, and the whole arrangement dissolved before Mary was old enough to understand that it had ever existed. But here is what I want you to hold on to. She'd been part of a marriage negotiation before she could speak, before she could walk, before she had any concept of what a marriage was, or a kingdom, or a foreign country, or any of the words that would eventually define her entire life. Now that is an extreme case. Mary Queen of Scots was a particular kind of political asset, a reigning queen in her own right, the most valuable girl in the whole of Britain from the moment she was born, and the speed with which her future was arranged reflected just how desperately the men around her wanted to control what she represented. But the principle was not unusual. Betrothal at very young ages, sometimes in infancy, commonly at 5, 6 or 7 years old, was a standard feature of the royal and noble marriage system throughout the medieval and early modern period. And what happened after that betrothal in the years before the marriage could actually take place was its own fascinating world. 7 was considered in medieval thinking the age of reason, the point at which a child could begin to understand the moral and spiritual weight of a commitment. Below 7 betrothals were technically not binding in the strictest sense. Above 7 they hardened into something more serious, and so you had this peculiar situation where children of 7 or 8 or 9 were formally engaged, had undergone ceremonies, had been the subject of years of negotiation, and then simply waited. where they waited and how depended enormously on the specific arrangement. Some girls stayed with their own families until they were old enough to travel. Their mothers continued to raise them. Their tutors continued to instruct them. Their daily life went on much as it had before, except that somewhere in the back of every adult's mind, and increasingly in the girls' own minds, was the knowledge of where they were going and what they were going to become. Some girls were sent to their future husband's court to be raised there. This was considered particularly useful because it allowed the girl to learn the language and customs of her new country from childhood, building an identity that would hold when the time came for the marriage to be formalized. Mary Queen of Scots did exactly this after the English match fell through. She was sent to France at age 5 to be raised at the court of the king, who would eventually become her father-in-law. She spent 13 years in France. She arrived as a Scottish child who barely spoke French. She left as a French young woman who had almost forgotten Scotland. And then there was the third arrangement, perhaps the strangest one to our modern eyes, where a girl was sent to live in her future husband's household while he was also still a child. 2 children betrothed living under the same roof, years before anyone expected them to behave as a husband and wife, growing up alongside each other in the peculiar intimacy of shared childhood. Historians who have studied records from this period describe these relationships with a kind of careful fascination. The children were often treated more as siblings than as spouses. They shared lessons, played in the same gardens, ate at the same table, ran through the same corridors. They grew up knowing each other in the way that only children who share a childhood really know each other, not through formal courtship or diplomatic correspondence, but through the ordinary accumulation of days. Did that closeness produce fondness? Sometimes. Did it produce the kind of genuine adult love that later centuries would call a successful marriage? Sometimes. The records are mixed, and we should be honest about that. But the notable fact is this: the children raised together in these arrangements sometimes formed attachments to each other that the adults around them had not planned for and could not entirely control. The system that tried to determine everything, the treaty, the dowry, the timing could not determine whether 2 people who grew up together would actually come to care about each other. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But the uncertainty itself says something important about the humanity that persisted inside the machinery. Here is a question I want to ask you. Have you ever known from a very young age what your life was going to look like? Not hoped, not imagined, not vaguely expected, but known. Most of us, I think, experience the future as a kind of open space, uncertain, full of possibility in both directions. The particular anxiety of not knowing whether things will work out. These girls experienced something different. Their future was not open. It had been closed thoughtfully, deliberately, with considerable legal and financial architecture, often before they were old enough to have formed any opinion about it. And then they were raised inside the knowledge of what was coming, trained to inhabit a role that had already been decided, shaped toward an identity that belonged in some fundamental sense to someone else's design. What is it like to grow up knowing that, not as an abstract fear but as a daily reality confirmed every time a tutor corrected your French pronunciation, because you would need it every time a seamstress fitted you with clothes in your future country's style, every time an advisor explained another custom of the foreign court where you would spend your life? I think it must have done something very specific to the way these girls understood themselves. It would have made the line between who they were and who they were becoming, between their present self and their assigned self, very difficult to locate. And navigating that blurred boundary year after year was a particular kind of psychological work that history has almost entirely overlooked. But here is something I find genuinely moving about the documentary record from this period. Because even inside this closed future, inside the years of waiting and preparing and becoming there, is consistent evidence of something the system did not design and could not erase. The girls held on to themselves, quietly, carefully, sometimes invisibly but genuinely. They held on to the languages of their birth countries even when they were supposed to be learning new ones. They kept their childhood dolls and their prayer books and their particular ways of arranging their rooms. They wrote letters home full of specific personal questions about dogs and gardens and sisters and what had been cooked for dinner on a particular saint's day. They formed deep friendships with the ladies from their home countries who came with them, keeping those women close for decades as anchors to the people they'd been before. And they formed opinions about their tutors, about the customs of their new courts, about the food and the music and the way light fell differently in a foreign country. They had preferences and aversions and enthusiasms that were genuinely their own. They were not blank pages, not fully, not really, regardless of what the system wanted them to be. That refusal to be entirely erased, small, private, never dramatic enough to be called resistance, was perhaps the most consistent thing about them. Across different centuries, different countries, different levels of power and constraint, the self persisting inside the assigned role, quietly, persistently, irreducibly present. Those who managed that persistence most successfully, who found a way to remain genuinely themselves while also fulfilling what the system required, were often the ones who went on to build extraordinary lives inside the constraints they had been given. And in the next part of this story, we're going to meet some of them. Women who arrived young and foreign and alone, who spent years in the waiting spaces we've been describing, and who came out of that waiting as something the people who arranged their marriages had not entirely anticipated. Not instruments, not blank pages, not treaties that happened to have names. People. People who had used the waiting years well, who had watched and listened and learned and quietly prepared for something beyond the role that had been assigned to them. They are remarkable, and they are exactly where we are going next. Something happens when you tell people that history was brutal for women, and then you tell them the whole story. Because the whole story is not as simple as brutal. Yes, this system was designed around power, not people. Yes, girls were sent away young, trained to disappear into someone else's dynasty, handed over at borders and stripped of their identities. We have established that. We have sat with it. And I meant every word of it. But here is the question that has been sitting at the back of my mind this entire series, and I suspect it has been sitting at the back of yours too. What happened to the ones who found something inside all of that? The ones who walked into an impossible situation, and somehow not through luck, not through magic, but through intelligence and patience, and a particular kind of quiet resilience, built a life that was actually genuinely worth having, because they existed. More of them than you might think, and tonight I want to give them the space they deserve. Let us start with a love story, a real one. One that began as so many of the best love stories do, with two strangers shaking hands under extraordinary political pressure, and ended with 12 stone monuments scattered across the English countryside, monuments that are still standing today 700 years later, still telling anyone who walks past what it looks like when a man refuses to stop loving someone. Her name was Eleanor of Castile. She was 13 years old, some accounts say 10 when they first met, when her marriage was arranged to the future King Edward I of England. It was a deal between kingdoms, pure and simple. England needed to affirm its hold over Gascony. Castile wanted an ally. Eleanor was the youngest daughter of Ferdinand III, King of Castile, and Leon, and she was the solution to a border dispute. That is all she was supposed to be. They met. They were children, she a girl just entering her teenage years, he a 15-year-old who already had the kind of long angular build that would one day earn him the nickname Longshanks. They married in a ceremony at the monastery of Las Huelgas in Burgos in November of 1254, and then something unexpected happened. They liked each other. I know that sounds almost comically simple, But in a world where liking your spouse was considered a bonus at best and irrelevant at worst, it was actually extraordinary. Edward and Eleanor began as strangers bound by a treaty, and they became by all available historical evidence genuinely devoted companions. The household records of their court, which historians have combed through in remarkable detail, paint a picture of two people who simply preferred to be together. They travelled together constantly, which was unusual. They accompanied each other on military campaigns in Wales, in France, even on crusade to the Holy Land. Eleanor gave birth to their son in Caernarfon Castle in 1284, while Edward was busy suppressing a Welsh rebellion because she refused to be left behind. She went on crusade to Palestine with him. Heavily pregnant on ships across the Mediterranean, into one of the most contested and dangerous territories in the known world. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. Does that sound like a woman who was trapped? Maybe she was in the legal sense, certainly in the political sense. But she had found something inside that trap, a genuine partnership, a real friendship, a shared life that most people in any century never managed to find at all. And then she died. In November of 1290, Eleanor fell ill while travelling near Lincoln. She had survived 16 pregnancies, a crusade, and 4 decades of medieval royal life. And then a fever caught her at the edge of autumn, and within days she was gone. She was 49 years old. Edward, by all accounts, was destroyed. Not performing grief, not showing the appropriate kingly sorrow, genuinely destroyed. He wrote to the Abbot of Cluny in France, whom in life we dearly cherished, and whom in death we cannot cease to love. He did not remarry for nearly 10 years, an eternity for a medieval king who desperately needed alliances. And then he did something that no English monarch had ever done before and very few have done since. He traced the entire route of her funeral procession from Lincoln, where she died, all the way to Westminster, where she was buried, and at every single place where the procession stopped overnight, he ordered a stone monument to be erected. A cross, carved from the finest local stone, decorated with statues of her at different stages of her life reaching toward the sky. 12 crosses, at 12 stopping points, along a 200-mile road. 3 of them still exist today. You can go and stand next to them. You can look up at the stone figures, Eleanor the maiden, Eleanor the mother, Eleanor the queen, and feel the strange weight of a grief that is 700 years old, and somehow still present in the texture of the stone. The final cross stood in a part of London called Charing, which is why today you have Charing Cross Station. Every time someone boards a train at Charing Cross and looks up at that name, they are standing inside a monument to a marriage that began with a border dispute and a 13-year-old girl, and became one of the most documented love stories in medieval history. I find that genuinely astonishing, that the name on a London train station is quietly a memorial to a young royal bride who arrived as a political instrument and left as someone irreplaceable. Now I want to be careful here, because the story of Eleanor and Edward is extraordinary precisely because it was not the norm. For every Eleanor there were many more women for whom the personal mathematics of a royal marriage never quite worked out so beautifully. But what Eleanor's story shows us, and what I think is genuinely underappreciated about this period, is that the system was not airtight. It could not completely control what happened between two people once they actually began to live together. The treaties and the dowries and the border ceremonies could arrange the marriage. They could not arrange the relationship. And some of these young brides, through charm, through intelligence, through sheer force of personality, through the kind of warmth that makes people instinctively trust you, found ways to build real influence, real affection, real lives within the constraints they had been given. Take Philippa of Hainault. 13 years old when she arrived in England in 1227 in the middle of December, in bitter cold to marry the 15-year-old King Edward III. Her betrothal had been arranged as a payment. Her father provided ships and soldiers to help overthrow a king, and in return his daughter got a crown. There was nothing remotely romantic about the transaction, and yet Philippa did something unusual when her procession arrived in England. Despite the cold, despite the exhaustion of the journey, she kept leaving her carriage. Every time the procession passed through a village or a town, she had the curtains opened, she stepped out, and she greeted people. Not because protocol required it, because she understood intuitively that the people watching from the roadside were not just spectators. They were her people now, and she wanted them to feel that she saw them. When she arrived in London on Christmas Eve, the city's church bells rang out a welcome spontaneously, enthusiastically, in a way that was not scripted or commanded. London liked her immediately. That instinct to connect, to humanize, to step out of the carriage, when it would have been perfectly acceptable and considerably warmer to stay inside it, that was not something any tutor could teach. That was Philippa herself. That was a 13-year-old girl arriving in a foreign country in midwinter and deciding somewhere in the space between nervousness and duty to be genuinely present. She and Edward were married for over 40 years. Chroniclers called her in near unanimous terms the most courteous and compassionate queen England had ever had. The Chancellor of England wrote that no Christian king in the world had ever had so noble and gracious a lady for a wife. She helped build England's textile industry. She promoted commerce. She served as regent while Edward was at war. She pleaded for the lives of prisoners about to be executed and changed her husband's mind. She was in every meaningful sense not just a queen consort but a governing partner. And she started as a 13-year-old girl in a cold carriage deciding to step out and wave. So here is the question I keep turning over in my mind when I think about women like Eleanor and Philippa. Were they simply lucky? Did they happen to land in good situations with husbands who had the capacity for affection in courts where their particular gifts had space to grow? Partially, yes. Luck mattered enormously. A kind husband could make all the difference in the world. A court that valued intelligence over mere compliance gave a bright woman room to move. We should not pretend that every young bride who did not thrive simply lacked the fortitude of the ones who did. But I also think something else was at work. Because when I read the accounts of these women, their letters, the chroniclers' descriptions, the household records, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with luck. The women who thrived tended to share a quality that is surprisingly hard to name but instantly recognizable when you see it. A kind of deliberate attentiveness, an ability to read the room, to understand what was actually needed in a given moment, not what was expected, not what the protocol demanded, but what the human being in front of them actually needed. Philippa stepped out of the carriage because she read the crowd. Eleanor accompanied Edward into dangerous places because she read her husband. The women who survived, who more than survived, who genuinely flourished, seem to have had an almost uncanny ability to see the people around them clearly and to respond to what they saw. Is that a skill that was taught? In part, perhaps. These girls were trained in the management of courts and households from a young age. They learned to navigate complex social environments. But I think it went deeper than training. I think it was in many cases a genuine gift, a particular kind of emotional intelligence that made some of these women not just functional queens but genuinely remarkable ones. And here is the thing about that gift. It was not valued by the system that placed these women in their positions. The system valued fertility, compliance, political connection. It did not particularly care whether a queen was emotionally intelligent or not. But the women who had that quality used it anyway to build real marriages, to earn real loyalty, to accumulate real influence in a world that was not designed to give them any. They are handed a role, and some of them quietly transformed that role into something nobody had planned for. I want to leave you with one image before we move on, because I think it captures something essential about what thriving actually looked like for these women. When Eleanor of Castile died, Edward did not just commission 12 stone crosses. He also commissioned her tomb a magnificent effigy of gilt bronze cast by a London goldsmith and placed in Westminster Abbey next to the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor. You can still see it there today. Eleanor lying in quiet repose wearing flowing robes, her left hand raised to pull at the cord of her mantle, a characteristic gesture so specific, so personal, that it must have come from someone who had watched her do it in life. She wears the heraldic symbols of both her birth country and her adopted country, the castles and lions of Castile, the lions of England woven together in a repeating pattern around the edge of her pillow. Her first home and her second home inseparable, permanent, immortalized in metal. She arrived at 13 as a political instrument. She left her body carried 200 miles in a grieving procession, her memory carved in stone at 12 points along the road, her effigy crafted with a detail so intimate it can only have come from love as someone who had made herself irreplaceable, not by force, not by luck, but by being in the deepest and most consistent sense genuinely herself. That is one kind of story this system produced, and it matters just as much as the darker ones we've told and will tell. But speaking of darker stories in the part that follows, we turn to something that is perhaps the hardest chapter of this entire series to sit with. Because after all the politics, the journeys, the negotiations and the weddings, the real reckoning for most of these young women came in one specific, unavoidable, deeply dangerous moment. The moment when the purpose of the entire system finally came to claim them. Stay with me. There is a word that keeps appearing in the historical records of medieval and Tudor England whenever a young queen gave birth. The word is travail. It meant labour in the sense of work. But it also meant suffering, and the people who used it, the court officials, the ambassadors, the priests, the physicians, used both meanings at the same time, deliberately because everyone understood that for a young royal woman, the two things were inseparable. This is the part of the story I promised you at the end of the last chapter. The part that sat quietly behind all the politics and the journeys and the rare moments of genuine love we explored together. The part that no amount of education, preparation, diplomatic skill or personal courage could fully protect a woman from. Because once the wedding was over and the journey was done and a young bride had found her footing in a foreign court, the question that now hung over her entire existence, stated or unstated, asked by every ambassador and court official and mother-in-law who watched her from across a room, was a single relentless one. When will she conceive? Let us talk about what it actually meant to be the heir-producing mechanism of a medieval dynasty. Because I think we say the phrase so casually, she was expected to produce an heir, that we have stopped really hearing it. We say it and move on. But let us slow down and actually look at what it meant. It meant that a young woman's body, her physical health, her cycles, her pregnancies, her recoveries was not her own. It was a matter of state. It was tracked, monitored, discussed at council meetings and in diplomatic correspondence between courts, hundreds of miles apart. It was speculated about by ambassadors who had never met her. It was prayed over in churches. It was in the most literal sense imaginable everyone's business except hers. And the younger she was when the pressure began, the more dangerous that pressure became. The church had set its canonical minimums 12 for girls, 14 for boys as the earliest ages at which a marriage could be consummated. Those numbers were not pulled from the air. Medieval physicians, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, understood perfectly well that a very young girl's body was not equipped for pregnancy. Hippocrates himself had written about the dangers. Cyranus of Ephesus, one of the most important medical writers of the ancient world, had specified that women between the ages of 15 and 40 were most fit for conception. These ideas were known, they were discussed, and they were frequently ignored, because the political pressure to secure an heir did not wait politely for a girl's body to be ready. It arrived the moment the wedding contract was signed, and in too many cases it arrived far too soon. The story I want to tell you now is one that I genuinely cannot read without feeling something shift in my chest. Because it is not just a story about history. It is a story about what happens when a system treats a human body as a resource rather than a person. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. She was 12 years old when she married Edmund Tudor in November of 1455. Edmund was 25. She was the richest heiress in England, an orphan from the age of 1, a ward of the crown, a political asset who had been passed between guardians her entire childhood. Edmund wanted her estates. He also, it seems, wanted an heir quickly. He did not wait. Within months of their marriage, Margaret Beaufort was pregnant. She was 12 years old. Edmund Tudor died of the plague and captivity in November of 1456, leaving Margaret a 13-year-old widow who was 7 months pregnant and hundreds of miles from her mother in Wales. She travelled to Pembroke Castle in that condition, a journey that was difficult and dangerous at that stage because Pembroke was her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor's fortress, and it was the safest place she knew of. On the 28th of January 1457, in a chamber specially prepared for the birth, Margaret Beaufort went into labour. She was 13 years old. She was slight and petite, by all accounts still physically a child. The labour was long and excruciating. For some time those attending her believed that both she and the baby would die. Her confessor Bishop John Fisher described the child's birth as seeming a miracle that at that age and of so little a personage, anyone should be born at all. Both of them survived. The baby was a boy. Margaret named him Henry. He would one day become Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England. But the birth left Margaret damaged in ways that never healed. Despite marrying twice more in the years that followed, she never conceived another child. Not once. She'd been a mother and a widow at 13 years old, and her body still growing, still forming, had paid a price that could not be returned. Years later, when her son Henry VII proposed a marriage for Margaret's young granddaughter, Margaret Tudor, to the King of Scotland, Margaret Beaufort, now one of the most powerful women in England, objected strenuously. She argued specifically and passionately against the match happening too young. She drew on her own experience. She said she was afraid the girl would be injured. Think about that for a moment. A woman in her 60s at the height of her power, still carrying the memory of what happened to her at 13, still fighting to make sure it did not happen to someone she loved. She lost the argument, by the way. Young Margaret Tudor was sent to Scotland at 13 and a half. Her grandmother's fears were not unfounded. Now I want to be precise about something because I think accuracy matters here, and I do not want to overstate what the historical record shows. Not every young royal bride faced the immediate pressure that Margaret Beaufort faced. We talked in part 3 about how many marriages, especially among very young children, were formally delayed. There are documented cases of royal husbands who did in fact wait. Anne of Bohemia, who married Richard II at age 15, had a marriage that by all accounts was never primarily about children. At all. Theirs was a close affectionate partnership that produced no heirs, apparently without crisis or public scandal. Eleanor of Castile, whose story we explored in part 5, was formally married at 13, but seems to have lived with Edward as companion and partner for some time before children were expected. So the system was not uniform. It was not one single experience. There were husbands who respected the minimums courts that allowed young queens to settle in before demanding they perform marriages where the personal relationship was given time to breathe. But the pressure was always there. Underneath every royal marriage, regardless of how gentle the husband or how enlightened the court, the same fundamental expectation sat waiting. The Queen's job was to produce a living male heir, and when she did not, or when she could not, the consequences could be catastrophic. You want an example of catastrophic? I will give you one that most people know the name of, but not the full weight of. Jane Seymour. She was Henry VIII's third wife, the one who followed Anne Boleyn to the throne, and is perhaps best known today as the one who gave him the son. She was around 28 years old when she married Henry in May of 1536. She was not a young bride in the way we've been discussing. She was an adult woman who understood exactly what she was walking into. But her story is still a perfect, devastating illustration of what the heir-producing expectation cost women. Jane conceived within months of the marriage. Her pregnancy was followed with intense, exhausting public interest. The entire court, the entire country was invested in the contents of her womb in a way that I suspect would feel almost unbearable from the inside. She went into labour in October of 1537. The labour lasted 2 days and 3 nights. The baby was positioned awkwardly. It was gruelling and dangerous and extraordinarily painful. And by the time the boy was finally born at 2 a.m. on the 12th of October 1537, everyone around Jane was simply grateful that it was over. The child was healthy. He would grow up to become Edward VI, the son Henry VIII had spent over 20 years desperately pursuing. The birth announcements went out. Jane signed them herself. She sat up in bed and received the christening guests. She seemed to be recovering. And then 4 days later she became very ill. An infection had set in what physicians of the time could not prevent or treat, and what we now recognize as puerperal fever, a bacterial infection that spread rapidly in an era before antibiotics, before any understanding of sterility, before any way to stop what had already begun. 12 days after giving birth to the son who secured the dynasty, Jane Seymour died at Hampton Court Palace. She was 28 or 29 years old. Henry VIII apparently mourned her more genuinely most historians believe than he mourned any of his other wives. He wore black for months. When he died 10 years later, he had himself buried beside her in Windsor Castle. Whatever his feelings for the other women in his life, complicated to say the least, Jane had given him the one thing the entire system was designed to produce, and it had killed her. That is the transaction at the heart of this story. The most important thing a queen could do was the most dangerous thing a queen could do. Now here is where I want to offer you a thought that I have been turning over for a long time because I think it changes how we see this history. We tend to look at these deaths and injuries as tragedies that happened within the system, terrible outcomes of an otherwise functioning machine. But I think they were more than that. I think they were evidence that the system had a fundamental design flaw that the people inside it could see clearly and often chose to ignore. The evidence that early pregnancy was dangerous was not hidden. Medieval physicians knew it. The Church had encoded some protection against it in canon law. Margaret Beaufort knew it from her own body at 13 and spent the rest of her life trying to warn others. Queen Elizabeth I of Russia, centuries later, would specifically cite the dangers of early marriage in her advice to her successors. The knowledge was there. It was just consistently outweighed by political urgency. What strikes me most about this history is not the ignorance, it is the awareness. The people making these decisions, the fathers, the kings, the guardians, often knew exactly what they were risking. And they decided again and again that the political value of a secured heir was worth the gamble with a young woman's health and life. Does that sound familiar? The gap between what is known to be harmful and what is done anyway, because convenience or power or urgency makes the harm easier to rationalize. That is not just a medieval problem, that is a human problem. And seeing it clearly in the past is one of the reasons history is worth studying in the first place. But I want to end this part of the story not with anger, and not with grief alone, because the historical record gives us one more thing worth holding on to. Margaret Beaufort survived. She survived Edmund Tudor's disregard for her age. She survived a labour that her confessor called a miracle. She survived the Wars of the Roses' widowhood at 13 poverty political exile, and the years-long separation from her only child. And then she spent the next 50 years of her life becoming one of the most formidable women in English history, a patron of education, a founder of colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, a political strategist who helped orchestrate the overthrow of a king and place her son on the throne of England. She called Henry her only child, the son whose birth nearly killed her, all my worldly joy. He called her my most loving mother. The letters they exchanged across years of separation are still preserved, and they are warm and real and full of the kind of devotion that only two people who had come very close to losing each other can fully understand. The system tried to reduce Margaret Beaufort to a vessel, and she became a dynasty. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. In the next part, we're going to meet women who did something even more deliberate with what the system gave them. Women who did not just survive, but who actively bent the rules, defied the expectations, and transformed the limitations of their position into something nobody had anticipated. Women who took resistance seriously in an age when resistance came at an extraordinary price. Stay with me. Resistance in the medieval world was not a simple thing. It was not a march in the street or a petition signed by thousands. It was quieter than that, more dangerous than that, and often far more ingenious than that, because when you are a woman in a system that has assigned you a role and surrounded you with people whose job is to make sure you stay in it, resistance cannot look like resistance. It has to look like something else entirely. It has to wear a disguise, and some of the most extraordinary women in all of royal history were at their core brilliant disguisers. They bent the rules by appearing to follow them. They accumulated power by pretending not to want it. They outlasted kings, outlasted dynasties, outlasted the entire machinery that had tried to reduce them to instruments, and they did it with a smile on their face and a carefully chosen word at exactly the right moment. Tonight we meet a few of them, and I promise you by the time we are done you will never look at the phrase well-behaved woman the same way again. Let us start with someone whose story I find genuinely thrilling, not because she was perfect, not because she always won, but because she refused at every single turn to accept the limits that the world tried to set around her. Eleanor of Aquitaine. You have heard the name, but I want to make sure you really hear the story. She was born around 1122 in southwestern France, the eldest daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine. Her father died when she was 15, leaving her the sole heiress of one of the largest and wealthiest territories in all of France, which meant that Eleanor of Aquitaine at 15 years old was simultaneously the most eligible and the most endangered young woman in Europe. Every powerful man on the continent suddenly wanted to marry her not for her sake, but for her land. Within weeks of her father's death, she was claimed as a bride by the French crown. She married Louis VII of France that same year. She was 15, he was 17. And right from the beginning, Eleanor did something that the court around her was not quite sure what to do with. She kept her opinions. She expressed them loudly. She involved herself in politics. She went on crusade to the Holy Land in 1247, which was not considered an appropriate place for a queen, and which Eleanor attended anyway, leading a retinue of her own ladies and refusing to simply stay behind and wait. The marriage to Louis eventually ended in annulment after 15 years, officially on grounds of distant kinship, unofficially because they could not stand each other, and she had only produced daughters, and the French crown needed sons. Eleanor got her lands back. She was free. She was 30 years old, the most powerful landowner in Western Europe, and technically a single woman for approximately 6 weeks before she married again. Her new husband was Henry, Duke of Normandy, who was 11 years younger than her. Within 2 years, he had become King Henry II of England, making Eleanor a queen for the second time. And this is where the story gets truly extraordinary. Eleanor and Henry spent nearly 2 decades together, producing 8 children, and ruling an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But somewhere in the middle of all of that, something shifted. Henry took a young mistress, a woman named Rosamund Clifford, and made no attempt to conceal it. Eleanor, who had not spent 30 years of her life accumulating power and experience to be simply humiliated in public, separated from her husband, and withdrew to her own lands at Poitiers. And at Poitiers she did something remarkable. She established a court. Her own court. A living, breathing cultural centre where poets and troubadours and artists gathered under her patronage, a place that became associated in the historical memory of the 12th century with what we now call the tradition of courtly love. Songs about devotion, about honour, about the idealised love of a knight for a lady who held the real power in the relationship. Eleanor at Poitiers was essentially rewriting the cultural narrative of her time. In the real world, women were assigned roles and kept there. In the songs her court produced, women were the arbiters, the judges, the ones whose favour determined everything. Was this political commentary? Was it conscious resistance? Was it Eleanor simply doing what she loved because she could now that she was free of Henry's court? Probably all three. That is the thing about Eleanor. She was too complicated for simple explanations. And then she did something that had genuinely no precedent in the history of the English or French crowns. In 1173 she helped organise a rebellion against her own husband, led by their sons, backed by foreign allies, a genuine armed uprising against the king. She was captured while trying to flee to France, reportedly disguised as a man on horseback. Henry had her imprisoned. For 15 years she moved between his various strongholds, comfortable enough, never executed, but confined, watched, controlled. 15 years. And then Henry died in 1189. His son Richard became king. And one of the very first things Richard the Lionheart, Eleanor's favourite son, did as the new King of England was send orders to release his mother. Eleanor of Aquitaine walked out of imprisonment at 65 years old, and then she went to work. She organised Richard's coronation. She ruled England as regent while he went on crusade. When he was captured and held for ransom by the Duke of Austria, she personally raised the ransom, and then she travelled to retrieve him herself, crossing the Alps in winter. She managed rebellions, negotiated with foreign kings, and signed herself in official correspondence as Eleanor by the grace of God, Queen of England, taking a title she had not officially held for years and simply using it, because no one could stop her and she knew it. She lived to be around 80 years old, dying in 1204 at the monastery of Fontevraud. She'd been a queen of France, a queen of England, a prisoner, a rebel, a regent, a diplomat. She'd worn the crown twice from 2 different kingdoms. She had outlasted everyone who had tried to contain her. Now let me ask you something. Do you think Eleanor of Aquitaine was ever for a single moment of her life what anyone expected her to be? I want to show you a very different kind of resistance now. Because Eleanor's story is full of drama and fire and armed rebellion, and that is not the only way it was done. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman could do was simply choose to be unremarkable, on purpose. Anne of Cleves arrived in England in December of 1539 to become the 4th wife of Henry VIII. She was 24 years old, a German princess from the Duchy of Cleves, and she had been selected on the basis of a portrait painted by Hans Holbein. Henry had looked at the painting and thought yes. He had then met the actual woman and immediately felt no. The story that has come down through history is that Anne was somehow unattractive, that she disappointed Henry in person, that she was the Flanders mare, a nasty nickname invented by a commentator who was not even born until after Henry died and never met her. Modern historians have largely demolished that story. The portrait Holbein painted of Anne survives. She was by any reasonable assessment perfectly attractive. The real issue was that Henry had already become infatuated with a young woman at court named Catherine Howard, and he wanted a way out of a marriage he had barely begun. Anne understood her situation immediately. She knew what had happened to the wives who came before her. She knew that Henry VIII's marriages had a certain pattern, and that the pattern did not tend toward happy endings. She had watched from across the Channel as one queen was abandoned and another was executed. She understood with a clarity that historians have consistently underestimated exactly what she was dealing with. So Anne of Cleves made a choice that only becomes fully visible when you look at what happened next. When Henry moved to annul the marriage, Anne did not protest. She did not argue. She did not appeal to her brother or invoke her rights, or insist on any of the diplomatic protections that a foreign princess might reasonably have claimed. She signed the annulment papers. She wrote a letter to Henry that was by all accounts a masterwork of diplomatic grace, humble, warm, completely devoid of resentment, expressing nothing but goodwill toward the king and a desire to please him in whatever way he preferred. And in exchange for that gracious, unchallenging, apparently effortless exit, she received Richmond Palace, Hever Castle, the former home of the Boleyns, £4,000 a year for the rest of her life, a rank of precedence second only to the Queen and the King's daughters, and the honorary title of the King's beloved sister. Anne of Cleves spent the next 17 years living comfortably in England, attending court, when she wished maintaining warm relationships with Henry's children, gambling, occasionally declining all offers of remarriage, including an offer from her own brother to send her back to Cleves and arrange another match, which she firmly refused. She outlived Henry. She outlived his next 2 wives. She outlived his son Edward. She was in the end the last of the 6 wives, standing the only one buried in Westminster Abbey with full honours. She'd been married for 6 months. She'd survived by doing something that looked on the surface like complete submission. But it was not submission. It was strategy. She'd assessed a dangerous situation with perfect accuracy, identified the one available move that would get her what she wanted and executed it without flinching. Anne of Cleves did not fight the system. She used it. She walked out of a marriage to the most dangerous man in England with 2 palaces, a fortune, and her freedom, while the man who'd arranged the marriage in the first place lost his head. Thomas Cromwell, for the record, was executed that same summer. Anne went gambling. There is something I want to say directly because I think it matters. When we look at women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Anne of Cleves side by side, we might be tempted to rank their kinds of resistance. Eleanor was brave and dramatic and openly defiant. Anne was quiet and strategic and apparently compliant. Which one was more courageous? I think that is the wrong question. I think both of them were doing the same thing, reading the room they were actually in, assessing what was available to them, and choosing the move that gave them the most control over their own lives. The rooms they were in happened to be very different rooms. Eleanor had land armies' sons and a husband whose authority was distributed across an empire, and therefore more resistible. Anne had a husband with a history of executing wives and a personality that required careful handling above all else. Each woman used what she had. Each woman refused in her own way, on her own terms, to simply disappear. That refusal, quiet or loud-armoured or silk-gloved, imprisoned or palatially comfortable, is the thread that connects these women across centuries. And the more I read about them, the more I think the women who survived this system did so, not despite the intelligence they were trained to express in music and languages and household management, but because of it. The system gave them tools, not knowing what they would do with them. and some of them used those tools in ways nobody planned for. But here is what keeps me awake at night when I think about all of this, and I will tell you about it in the next part of our story. Because there is one question underneath all of these individual lives, one question that runs like a current beneath the whole history we've been telling together. And it is this: when did the world actually start to change? When did the people inside this system, not just the women surviving it, but the men running it, the courts sustaining it, the cultures that had built it over centuries, when did they start to ask whether any of it made sense? The answer is more complicated than you expect, and it starts in a place that might surprise you. Stay with me. Here is a question I genuinely love asking people when this topic comes up, because the answer almost always surprises them. Who do you think had more freedom to choose who they married in medieval Europe, the princess in the castle or the farmer's daughter in the village? Take a moment. Think about it. Because most people, if they are being honest, would say the princess. She had wealth status, fine clothes, tutors, entire households of attendants. Surely she had more options. Surely her world was bigger. And yet the answer, the historically documented, demographically verified, surprisingly consistent answer across centuries of European history is the farmer's daughter. Almost without exception, the woman with the most freedom to choose her husband in medieval and early modern Europe was more often than not the woman with the least wealth. And the woman with the least freedom, the woman most completely controlled by other people's calculations, was almost always the woman with the most. That is the great upside-down truth of this history. And tonight I want to sit with it, because I think it tells us something profound, not just about the past, but about what power actually costs the people who hold it. Let us start with the numbers, because they genuinely caught me off guard when I first read them. 1,000 marriage certificates issued by the Church in Canterbury between 1619 and 1660, a detailed record covering an enormous cross-section of English society, tell a story that directly contradicts what most people think they know about marriage in the old days. Of those 1,000 brides, 966 were 19 years old or older at the time of their first marriage. Only one bride in the entire 1,000 was 13 or younger. The most common age for a woman to marry was 22, for men 24. The average age for women across the full sample was 24 years old, for men nearly 28. 24, not 12, not 15, 24, and the youngest brides in those records every single time they were from the nobility. They were the daughters of the gentry, of minor lords, of the families with property and alliances to protect. The common women, the spinners, the dairy maids, the daughters of craftsmen and farmers were waiting, earning, building something of their own before they walked down the aisle. Let me tell you why. There was a pattern in northwestern Europe so consistent, so distinctive, that historians gave it a name, the European marriage pattern. And understanding it changes the entire picture we have been building together. In most of Europe, from roughly the 14th century onward, young people of the working and farming classes spent their teenage years and early 20s not at home, not waiting to be assigned to a husband, but working, in service. As household servants, farm hands, apprentices in workshops, helpers in bakeries and breweries, and wool processing operations. They left their parents' homes at around 12 or 13 not to get married but to go to work for someone else. They saved their wages. They built up a small store of funds, linens, tools, the basics of a household. And then when they had enough to establish a small home of their own, they got married to someone they had met themselves. Someone from the same village most likely, or from a nearby one. Someone they had seen at the market at the parish church, at the seasonal festivals where young people from several villages gathered and danced, and yes, courted each other without formal arrangement and without ambassadors negotiating the terms. A peasant girl of 15 in medieval England was quite possibly already working in someone else's kitchen, earning her own keep, accumulating her own small future. She was not sitting in a tower waiting for someone to decide her fate. She was out in the world, a limited world, a circumscribed world, a world with its own hardships and injustices, but out in it nonetheless. Meanwhile, a princess of 15 had her fate settled before she could form an independent opinion about it. I find that deeply ironic, and I think it is one of the most important things this history has to teach us. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I am not about to stand up and tell you that it was wonderful to be a peasant woman in medieval Europe. It was not. It was grueling, physically exhausting, legally precarious, frequently dangerous work. A peasant woman laboured in the fields alongside her husband, managed the household, raised the children, and then laboured some more. She had almost no legal rights once she was married. She could not own property in her own name. She could not represent herself in court. She was in the eyes of the law effectively invisible, absorbed into her husband's legal identity the moment she said her vows. She also had a far shorter life expectancy than any princess. She was far more vulnerable to famine, disease, violence, and simple grinding poverty. The castle on the hill may have been a cage in some respects, but it had warm rooms and regular meals which the village absolutely did not guarantee. So this is not a competition about who had it worse. Both groups of women lived inside systems designed by men for men with women's desires as an afterthought at best. The difference is one of which specific way the system constrained you, and for the peasant woman the particular constraint of a very early politically arranged marriage was not typically among her burdens. That burden belonged almost exclusively to the women with the most to give, and here is what I find so philosophically interesting about that fact. Let me ask you something directly. When we think about privilege and disadvantage in history in any period, any society, we tend to assume they travel in a straight line. More wealth equals more freedom. Higher status equals more choices. That is the intuitive assumption. And in some ways and for some things it is true. But the history of royal brides blows a very large hole in that assumption. Because the very thing that made these women valuable, their bloodline, their inheritance, their political utility, was precisely the thing that made them unfree. The more a girl was worth in the currency of dynastic alliance, the less she got to decide anything about her own life. The Canterbury marriage records show only one bride in 1,000 married at 13 or younger. That bride was from the nobility. The 966 women who married at 19 or older, in the prime of their young adulthood, with their own earnings and their own feet on their own paths, most of them were not. There is something in that inversion that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. That the most powerful thing a woman could own in that world, wealth, royal blood, political connection, was also the thing most likely to be used against her. That value in the wrong system can be a trap as surely as poverty can. Let me bring this alive with something specific. Because the numbers are interesting, but people are more interesting than numbers. Think about two girls born in England in the year 1400. Let us call them Eleanor and Alice, just to give them names. Eleanor is the youngest daughter of a minor nobleman. She has a small castle, a few hundred acres of land, and a name that connects two families with regional political ambitions. By the time Eleanor is 8, her father has already had preliminary conversations with two neighbouring families about a possible match. By 12, she's formally betrothed to a boy she has met twice. By 15, she's married, and in her husband's household learning the management of his estate, producing heirs as quickly as her body will allow, writing careful letters home to her mother asking after the garden. Alice is the daughter of a village blacksmith. At 12, she is sent to work in the household of a local merchant, washing linens and helping in the kitchen, in exchange for a small wage and her keep. She is gone from home, but she is earning. She sees the world, at least the corner of it, within a few miles of where she grew up. She meets boys at the spring fair. She makes friends with other girls working in similar households. She saves. She waits. At 22 or 23, she marries a young man she has known for 2 years, a carpenter from the next village, someone who courted her with a pair of ribbons at the Easter market and made her laugh. They set up house together with their combined small savings. Eleanor had more. In almost every measurable way, food, warmth, security, education, fine clothing, the certainty of being housed and fed. But Alice chose. I think about Eleanor and Alice a lot, because they are both real in the sense that they represent millions of actual women whose individual names we will never know. And the distance between them, the distance between having and choosing, is one of the oldest tensions in the history of women's lives. Now there is one more thing I want to tell you about the common women of medieval Europe that gets almost no attention in the stories we tell about this period, and it is this. While princesses were shipped across Europe like diplomatic parcels, while young queens were transformed at border crossings and had their dogs taken from their arms, while noble women were parcelled out to settle property disputes, ordinary women in medieval Europe were in many documented cases actively resisting arranged marriages of their own. Church law in the 12th century established something that sounds almost modern. In its framing, a valid marriage required the free consent of both parties. No consent, no valid marriage. The church courts, which handled all matrimonial disputes, actually heard cases from women who had been coerced. And in a number of those cases, not all but a notable number, the women won. There are records of peasant girls who refused matches their lords or fathers arranged. There are records of women who married in secret outside the formal process and then appeared before church officials to have the marriage recognized. There are records of lords fining families because their daughters had simply gone ahead and married whomever they pleased without permission, and there was nothing to be done about it after the fact except collect the fine. Was the system fair? No. Was it consistently enforced? No. Did the consent doctrine protect every woman who needed it? Absolutely not. But it existed. It was invoked. And the women who invoked it were overwhelmingly not the women in the castles. The women in the castles had treaties to honour. I want to leave you with one final thought before we move on, because it has been sitting with me all the way through this part of the story. The myth that everyone in medieval Europe got married young and arranged is one of the most persistent historical misunderstandings I know of, and it matters not because it is interesting to correct, but because of what it implies. If we believe everyone was married off at 12, we accidentally make the experience of the royal brides universal. We flatten it. We say, well, that was just how things were, everyone lived that way. But they did not. The farmer's daughter waited until she was 24 and chose the man she married. That was also how things were. The royal bride's experience was not how things were. It was how things were for a small, specific, politically valuable group of women, and understanding that specificity is the only way to understand the full weight of what they carried. They were not suffering what everyone suffered. They were suffering something that was in fact reserved for them, because of exactly who they were. That is not an accident of history. That is the design of a system that knew exactly what it was doing. In the next part, we follow the thread of that design all the way to its breaking point to the century when educated voices inside Europe began slowly to ask whether any of it made sense, and to the specific extraordinary women who were standing at the exact moment the world started at last to change its mind. Stay with me. Something has been quietly bothering me all the way through this series, and I want to say it out loud. We've been talking about a system, analysing it, examining it from multiple angles, looking at who it crushed and who it somehow produced strength in despite everything. And we have done that honestly, I think. But there is a question underneath all of it that I have been circling without asking directly. And the question is this: did the people who ran this system ever stop and wonder whether it was right? Not just the women inside it. We have established that women navigated, resisted, survived, sometimes brilliantly. But what about the men who arranged the matches, signed the treaties, kissed their daughters goodbye at the edge of a road? What about the kings and fathers and ambassadors? Did the discomfort ever find them? Did any of them, in the privacy of their own chambers, or in the honest hours after midnight, look at what the system required and feel something that resembled doubt? The answer, when you dig into it, turns out to be far more complicated and far more human than you might expect. Let me begin with a letter that I think is one of the most remarkable documents in all of medieval history, not because it is dramatic, not because it changes anything, but because of the raw, unguarded honesty inside it. The year is 1348. The Black Death is moving across Europe in a wave that most people have no framework to understand, because nothing like it has happened in living memory. It will eventually kill between 30 and 50% of the entire European population. It is by any measure the worst natural catastrophe the continent has ever experienced. King Edward III of England, the same Edward whose wife Philippa we spent time with in Part 5, the beloved Queen, has a 14-year-old daughter named Joan. She is his favourite by many accounts, and in the summer of 1348 she is on her way to Spain to be married to the heir to the throne of Castile. The match has been negotiated for years. Her trousseau, the chests of plate and tapestry and silk and household goods that will accompany her into her new life, fills an entire ship. She travels with over 100 armed soldiers to protect her and her dowry. Everything has been arranged. Everything has been planned. The mayor of Bordeaux, where Joan's party stops to rest, warns them the plague has arrived here. They should leave. They stay. We do not know exactly why. Possibly her household does not yet understand what the plague means. Possibly they are too large a party to move quickly. Possibly, and this is the detail that sits with me, no one in that party had seen the plague yet because it had not reached England, and they simply could not imagine the scale of what was being warned about. Joan catches the plague. She's moved to a small village near Bordeaux to recover. She dies on the 2nd of September 1348. She is 14 years old. She's 3 months away from her wedding. She never crosses the Pyrenees. She never meets her intended husband. She never becomes a queen. She dies of a disease in a village in the south of France, far from her parents, and her body cannot even be brought home because plague victims had to be buried where they fell. Edward III wrote a letter to the King of Castile after he learned what had happened, and the letter, translated by historians from the Latin, preserved in the archives, is not a diplomatic communication, or not only that, it is a father writing about his daughter, and the words he chose are ones that pierce through the formality of the age straight into something unmistakably personal. He writes that destructive death has lamentably snatched from both of us our dearest daughter, whom we loved best of all as her virtues demanded. He describes death as something that seizes young and old alike, sparing no one, and reducing rich and poor to the same level. And then he writes this: no fellow human being could be surprised if we were inwardly desolated by the sting of this bitter grief, for we are humans too. For we are humans too. I've read a great deal of medieval royal correspondence. It tends toward the formal, the strategic, the precisely worded. This is none of those things. This is a king reminding another king reminding himself, perhaps, that underneath the treaties and the negotiations and the deliberate deployment of daughters, as diplomatic instruments, the people involved were human. The grief was real. The love was real. Does that change anything about the system that sent Joan to Bordeaux? No, it does not. Edward sent her. He made that choice. He did not refuse the match, did not keep her home, did not insist on waiting. The machinery of dynastic marriage was too large, too established, too expected for one father's reluctance to stop it even when that father was a king. But the fact that he felt it, the sting of that specific word, desolated, matters, because it tells us something important. The people who built and maintained this system were not uniformly indifferent to what they were doing. The grief was in the room. It just was not usually loud enough to stop the room from functioning. There were, however, voices that were louder. And here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the criticism of what this system did to young women, particularly the question of whether girls were being sent away too young and prepared too poorly for what awaited them, did not start with the Enlightenment or the 19th century or the reformers of the modern era. It started inside the medieval world itself. In some cases, it started inside the very courts that were perpetuating the practice. The most striking example I know of is a woman who was not a queen, not a princess, not anyone who could be expected to have this kind of platform at all. She was a poet, a writer, a woman who had been widowed young in late 14th century France, left to support 3 children on her own, and who chose to do so by becoming the first woman in European history to support herself entirely through writing. Her name was Christine de Pizan, and in 1405 she published a book that stands even today as one of the most extraordinary acts of intellectual courage in the medieval record. The Book of the City of Ladies begins with Christine reading a text by a male author that argues at length that women are morally inferior, intellectually deficient, and a general burden to civilized life. And Christine, who is sitting in her study surrounded by books visibly, a person who has educated herself deeply, has a moment of extraordinary self-awareness. She describes feeling as she reads these arguments a kind of shame wash over her, because these things were being said by educated men she had otherwise admired, and she found herself, despite everything she knew about herself, despite the evidence of her own life, almost beginning to believe them. And then she stops, she puts down the book, and she decides to write back. The Book of the City of Ladies is at its core a sustained, documented, carefully argued refutation of the idea that women were worth less than men. Christine builds her case through history, through evidence of women who governed, who led armies, who wrote philosophy, who demonstrated every quality that the male writers of her time reserved exclusively for men. She is making in 1405 an argument that we would now recognize as deeply modern, that the limitations placed on women were not natural but constructed, that women were not what the text said they were, that the texts were wrong. And one of her most pointed arguments concerned exactly what we've been discussing, the marriage of very young girls to men they did not know, for purposes they had no part in deciding. Christine did not have the language that we have now. She did not use words like agency or consent in their contemporary sense, but she asked questions that pointed directly at those concepts. Why are girls not educated as fully as their brothers? Why are their minds treated as less worthy of development than their bodies? Why does a system that claims to value women as mothers and wives make so little effort to prepare them as people? She did not receive a satisfying answer in her lifetime. Her books went largely ignored by the powerful men who were in a position to change anything. But they were read. They were copied. They circulated among the educated women of the 15th and 16th centuries, including historians have found Queen Elizabeth I of England, who had copies of Christine's work in her personal library. That is not nothing. Ideas travel slowly, but they travel, and Christine was not alone even in her own century. Erasmus of Rotterdam, one of the most influential scholars of the early 16th century, a man whose letters and writings shaped the intellectual culture of an entire era, was explicit in his criticism of child marriage. He argued that girls married too young had no chance to develop the judgment, the character, the full personhood that a good marriage required from both partners. He wrote about the damage done to young bodies and minds by being thrust into adult responsibilities before they were ready. He was writing in the early 1500s when the practice he was criticizing was still entirely normal among the nobility of Europe. Did his criticism change things immediately? No. But it shifted something. It added another voice to a conversation that was slowly, incrementally becoming impossible to ignore. Because here is the thing about conscience, about the moments when a system begins to doubt itself. It does not happen in a single dramatic reversal. It happens in accumulations. A king writes a letter about his dead daughter that sounds more like a human being than a monarch. A widowed poet publishes a book arguing that women are as capable as men. A scholar writes that sending children into marriage before they are formed is not wisdom but damage. None of these moments by themselves moves the machinery, but together across time they create a pressure, a slow, quiet, persistent pressure that eventually changes the shape of what the machinery produces. Here is a question I want to ask you directly, and I want you to actually think about it, rather than just reading past it. When you look at the men in this history, the fathers, the kings, the negotiators, how do you judge them? It is easy to feel a simple, clear emotion they were wrong, and they knew it, and they did it anyway. And that is in some sense true. They were wrong. Edward III knew he was sending his daughter into danger. He sent her anyway. He wrote about the grief after, but not about the refusal before. But I think the historical truth is more uncomfortable than simple condemnation allows for. Because these men were not monsters operating outside their culture. They were products of a system so thoroughly established, so deeply embedded in every structure of political life that questioning it was genuinely radical. The system had been functioning for centuries. Every ally they had, every peace they had secured, every boundary that held all of it was threaded through with marriages like the ones they were arranging. To refuse to send your daughter was not just a personal choice. It was a political act with real consequences for everyone in the kingdom who depended on that alliance holding. I'm not saying that makes it right. I'm saying that moral clarity is expensive, and it has always been expensive, and most of the time in any era most people cannot afford it. The ones who could, the Christine de Pizan, the Margaret Beauforts, who fought to protect their granddaughters from the experience they themselves had endured, the small number of scholars and thinkers who stood up and said plainly that this was harmful, those people paid a price. They were not listened to mostly. They were marginalized, dismissed, read by women in private, while the men who ran things continued to run things. But they were right. And being right even when no one is listening yet is not nothing. It is, as it turns out, everything eventually. I want to leave you with one more image from this particular thread of the story, because I think it captures something essential about where we are in the arc of what we've been building together. Joan of England is buried in France. Her body was never returned to England. Her father paid for men to go and retrieve it, and there is no record that they succeeded. She lies somewhere in the south of France, still in Bordeaux, or in a small village called Lormont in Earth, that is not her homeland, in a country she was travelling through, on the way to becoming someone else's queen. On the tomb of Edward III at Westminster Abbey there is a small statue. A bronze weeper, one of the little mourning figures that medieval tombs often carried around their edges. Historians believe it is Joan, small, delicate, placed there by a father who could not bring home what he had sent away. He built the tomb. He put her there in bronze on the edge of his own memorial. He wrote the letter with the grief inside it. He was a human being who loved his daughter and sent her into the world anyway because the world required it, and the world was larger than his grief. That is the paradox at the heart of this entire history. Not cruelty, not indifference, but the collision between what a system demands and what a human heart knows. between the world as it is and the world as somewhere quietly, even the people making it run understand it should be. And it is precisely that collision, the growing gap between what the system required and what thoughtful people increasingly knew was right, that eventually forced a reckoning. That reckoning began, like most important reckonings, do not with the powerful, but with the people who were preparing to be sent. It began specifically with the question of what those girls actually knew when they set out, what they had been taught, what they had been given, whether the world they were stepping into was one they had been equipped to navigate or one they were walking into essentially blind, which is exactly what we're going to look at next. Imagine for a moment that you are 10 years old and someone sits you down and tells you exactly what your life is going to be. Not in vague terms, not "you will grow up and do great things," but specifically, you will go to a country you have never seen. You will speak a language you do not yet know. You will manage a household of hundreds of people. You will navigate the politics of a foreign court where every mistake is public and every enemy is watching. You will represent your family, your country, your religion, and your bloodline in every single thing you do every single day for the rest of your life. And then they hand you a Latin grammar book and a piece of embroidery and say, "Better get started." This is the part of the royal bride story that I find endlessly fascinating and endlessly revealing. Because how a family chose to prepare their daughter for that life tells you everything. It tells you what they thought she was worth, what they thought she was capable of, whether they saw her as an instrument to be deployed or as a person who would have to actually live inside the role they were sending her to fill, and the difference between the girls who were prepared and the girls who were not. That difference shaped not just their personal experience, but in some cases the course of nations. Let us begin with the gold standard. Because when historians talk about the education of royal daughters in the late medieval and early Renaissance period, one name comes up more than any other as the benchmark of what was possible: Catherine of Aragon. She was born in 1485, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile, and Aragon, the two monarchs who had united Spain, expelled the Moors from Granada, funded Christopher Columbus, and were widely considered the most formidable royal pair in Europe at the time. Isabella in particular was a woman who had clawed her way to a throne that everyone had tried to take from her, and she had done it partly through intelligence and partly through an absolute refusal to accept limitations that others told her were natural for a woman. And so when Isabella raised her daughters, she made a decision that was quietly radical for its time. She was going to give them a real education. Not the ornamental education of a girl expected to sit prettily and produce heirs, but a genuine intellectual formation, the kind given to the sons of great men. Catherine's tutors were scholars of the first rank. She studied the Bible and Latin histories. She read the Roman philosophers. She worked through classical literature, civil law, and canon law. She learned heraldry and genealogy. She studied music, dancing, and drawing. She developed a profound theological grounding that would serve her far beyond what anyone anticipated. And by the time she was 15 and ready to cross the ocean to England, she was fluent in Spanish and Latin, conversational in French, and developing her English. Here is a measure of what that education produced when Henry VIII, a man who was himself extraordinarily well-read and proud of it, got into theological arguments with Catherine of Aragon. In the middle of their marriage, arguments about scripture, about church authority, about doctrine, Catherine consistently won. Not by luck, not by charm, by being better prepared. Anne Boleyn, who was not known for underestimating her rivals, once told Henry after he'd come home rattled from one of these exchanges, "Did I not tell you that whenever you disputed with the Queen, she was sure to have the upper hand?" That is the legacy of Isabella of Castile's decision to educate her daughter properly. A 15-year-old girl arrived in England who could hold her own intellectually with one of the most educated kings in Europe, who could serve as regent while Henry was away at war in France, who could write letters in Latin to ambassadors, correspond with scholars, and advocate for the education of other women, who could, and did, negotiate her own legal position through years of crisis with a clarity and precision that left canon lawyers across Europe speechless. She was prepared. And because she was prepared, she was formidable. Now, let me show you the other side of this coin. 11 years after Catherine of Aragon arrived in England, a girl was born in Vienna who would one day become the most recognizable queen in French history. And her story is in many ways the cautionary tale of everything that Catherine of Aragon's story was not. Maria Antonia, she would not become Marie Antoinette until she crossed the French border and was given a French name to go with her. French life was born in 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Her mother was by any measure one of the most capable political leaders of the 18th century. Maria Theresa had fought off a war that nearly destroyed the Habsburg Empire when she inherited the throne, managed an empire of extraordinary complexity for 40 years, and produced 16 children, nearly all of whom she deployed as diplomatic instruments across Europe. You would think, given all of that Maria Theresa would have prepared her youngest daughter with the same rigour and attention that Isabella of Castile had given Catherine. But the honest historical record tells a more complicated story. Maria Antonia was for most of her early childhood simply not expected to matter very much. She was the 15th child. There were older sisters ahead of her in the diplomatic queue, sisters who were being groomed for the most important matches. Maria Antonia was playful, charming, pretty musically gifted. She was given music lessons, dancing lessons, deportment. She was taught to move through a room beautifully. She was taught to be delightful. What she was not taught was how to navigate the specific merciless labyrinthine world of a French royal court. She did not learn French history. She did not learn French law. She did not learn, and this would prove catastrophic, the extraordinarily elaborate codes of court etiquette that governed every waking moment at Versailles. In Austria, the Habsburg court was relatively informal by the standards of European royalty. Maria Theresa herself moved through her court with a warmth and directness that her courtiers found charming. Her children grew up in an atmosphere of comparative naturalness. Versailles was its opposite in every conceivable way. When Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles in May of 1770, she was 14 years old, and she walked into a world that operated according to rules so elaborate, so codified, so obsessively maintained, that they governed literally every physical movement she made from the moment she woke to the moment she slept. She was not permitted to eat her own food at official dinners without following a specific sequence of protocols. She was not permitted to have someone hand her a glass of water without a prescribed ceremony involving multiple people and specific rankings of precedence. The act of getting dressed in the morning, putting on her clothes, having her hair arranged, receiving the good morning greetings of the court, was a performance, a ritual watched by dozens of people, governed by who had the right to pass her what item in what order. And presiding over all of this with an expression of immovable severity was a woman known as the Comtesse de Noailles. Her official title was Mistress of the Household. Her unofficial title given to her by Marie Antoinette herself was Madame Etiquette, because her response to literally any situation, however absurd, however human, was to ask, what does protocol require? Marie Antoinette once fell off a donkey and lay laughing in the grass. The story goes that she turned to a nearby attendant and said with barely contained sarcasm, "Run and ask Madame Etiquette how a Queen of France is supposed to behave when she falls off a donkey." Whether or not those were her exact words, the spirit of it captures exactly how she experienced Versailles as a set of rules so divorced from actual human life that a person's natural response to falling down and laughing had to be filtered through protocol before it was allowed to exist. Now, some of this is funny, some of it reads almost like a comedy, but the consequences were not funny at all. Because Marie Antoinette was not prepared for this world, she responded to it the way many 14-year-olds respond to an overwhelming situation. She retreated. She found a smaller, more manageable space within the palace, first her private rooms, then eventually the Petit Trianon, the small chateau that Louis XVI gave her, where she could surround herself with people she actually liked, follow routines she actually chose, be something closer to herself. And in doing so, she made enemies. Powerful, patient, vindictive enemies. People whose status at court was entirely defined by their access to her, their right to hand her a towel, to stand near her at a public meal, and who felt that access disappearing as she withdrew. People who had been waiting years to accumulate influence through proximity to the Queen, and who watched a 14-year-old girl from Vienna unconsciously strip them of everything they had been working toward. The pamphlets started early. The nickname l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, was deployed against her almost from the moment she arrived, and it never left. It followed her all the way to the guillotine in 1793, when the crowds lining the street reportedly called it out as the cart carrying her passed by. I want to be careful here, because this is not a simple story of education saving one woman and ignorance destroying another. History is never that clean. Catherine of Aragon was extraordinarily well prepared, and she still lost everything: her marriage, her position, her access to her daughter, her health, her life. The education Isabella of Castile gave her produced a woman who fought with everything she had, and still could not hold the ground she was standing on, because the ground itself was being moved by forces that no amount of preparation could fully counter. And Marie Antoinette was underprepared for Versailles. Yes, but historians have also documented the ways in which she adapted over time, matured, became a more thoughtful queen and a deeply devoted mother, and faced the revolution with a courage and dignity that surprised people who had dismissed her as shallow. The woman who stepped into the cart in October of 1793 was not the frivolous teenager who had fled from Madame Etiquette into the Petit Trianon. She'd been remade by experience in ways that no amount of preparation could have substituted for. So the education was not everything, but it mattered. It mattered because preparation is not just about knowledge, it is about confidence. It is about walking into a room and knowing that you have the tools to navigate it. Catherine of Aragon walked into England at 15 and understood, at least intellectually, what was being asked of her and how to respond. She had a framework. Marie Antoinette walked into Versailles at 14 and found herself in a world so foreign to anything she knew that her first instinct was to hide from it. And when a queen hides from her own court, the court starts to tell stories about why. Here is the question I keep coming back to, and I want to ask it directly. If you were a parent, if you had a daughter, you were preparing to send into a difficult, demanding, politically dangerous world, what would you give her? Would you give her beauty? Yes, probably. It helps. Would you give her charm? Absolutely. It opens doors. Would you give her languages, history, law, philosophy, the full breadth of intellectual formation that would let her hold her own in any conversation in any court with any king? Isabella of Castile said yes, without hesitation, with a deliberateness that was unusual for her time, and that her daughter would spend the rest of her life demonstrating the value of. Maria Theresa, who was herself a formidable intellectual force, seems to have trusted that her daughter's charm and beauty and musical gifts would carry her through the court of Versailles. She was wrong. Not because those things did not matter, they mattered enormously, but because they were not enough. They were never going to be enough for what Versailles required. The difference between these two mothers' decisions is not a small historical footnote. It is a window into one of the most fundamental questions any era asks about girls. Are they to be ornamented or are they to be equipped? Are they to be beautiful instruments or capable agents? Are they to be prepared to perform or to think? And the answer different generations gave to that question shaped the women who came out of it, shaped them in ways that rippled far beyond their own individual lives into the courts and countries and centuries that came after them. The girls who were equipped, truly equipped intellectually and emotionally and practically, were the ones who could adapt when everything around them changed. And in the world of royal marriage, things changed constantly and without warning, and the cost of being unprepared was paid not just by the women themselves, but by everyone who depended on them. Which brings us to the last major question of this series, because we have spent 10 parts now exploring how this system worked, who it consumed, who survived it, how it evolved and what it produced, and there is one final thread left to pull. The thread of ending, of change, of the moment when the world began slowly, messily, unevenly to look at what it had been doing to its daughters and start to ask whether it could possibly be justified. That is where we're going next, and the story of how that change began and who paid the price to make it happen is one of the most fascinating chapters of all. Stay with me. The world did not change overnight. It never does. History rarely works the way we want it to, with a single dramatic moment when the old order cracks and the new one steps through, the gap clean and inevitable. What actually happens is messier, slower, and frankly, a great deal more interesting. What actually happens is that the pressure builds across decades, across generations, across the accumulated weight of too many individual tragedies and too many voices that refused finally to be quiet. And then one day the thing that everyone had called permanent and natural and simply how things are, quietly stops being that. This is the story of how the system we have been tracing together, the system that sent Isabella of Valois across a border at age 6 with her dolls, that shaped the ambitions of the Habsburgs into a continent-spanning empire through nothing but weddings, that broke Margaret Beaufort at 13 and remade her into something extraordinary. This is the story of how that system began at last to unravel. Not all at once, not cleanly, but genuinely and irreversibly. And the beginning of that unravelling is not where most people would look for it. Most people, if you ask them when ideas about marriage started to change, would point to the modern era. To the 20th century, perhaps. To the second wave of feminism, to no-fault divorce laws, to the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. And those things were real. They mattered enormously. But the shift in how people thought about marriage, and particularly about what a marriage was for and who it was supposed to benefit, began much earlier. And it began not with a law or a revolution, but with something quieter, an idea. The idea was this: marriage should be chosen. Both parties should want it. A woman should have a say. This sounds so obvious now that it is almost embarrassing to state. But in the context of everything we have discussed, in the context of a world where a 6-year-old could be legally handed to a king, where a 13-year-old girl could be assigned to a man twice her age because someone owned her wardship, where the entire machinery of European diplomacy was built on the premise that daughters were instruments of alliance, rather than people with preferences in that context. The idea was genuinely radical, and it had been building quietly since at least the 12th century in the most unlikely place, the church courts. Here is something that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. The Catholic Church, which we tend to think of as deeply conservative on questions of marriage and women's roles, was actually among the earliest institutional voices insisting on one foundational principle: consent. As far back as the 12th century church law held that for a marriage to be valid, truly legally, spiritually valid, both parties had to consent to it freely. Not grudgingly, not under duress, but willingly. A marriage made without genuine consent was technically not a marriage at all. Now in practice, this principle was honoured more in theory than in reality for most of the medieval period. The church courts heard plenty of cases from young women who had been coerced, and the outcomes were not always just. The pressure on daughters to comply with their family's wishes was enormous, and what counted as free consent in a world where refusing meant losing your inheritance, your social standing, and potentially your physical safety was a deeply contested question. But the principle was there, and it mattered, because ideas do not sit still. They travel, they accumulate. And over time, the principle that a marriage requires the genuine consent of both parties became a quiet but persistent pressure against the more extreme versions of forced dynastic marriage, particularly though not exclusively the marriage of children too young to understand what they were consenting to. The Church's canon law set the minimum ages at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Those numbers were low by any modern measure, but the intent was real. Below these ages there was no legal capacity for the kind of understanding consent required. And when marriages of very young children were later challenged in church courts, the consent doctrine gave the challenger something to stand on. By the 18th century, something more systematic was happening. The Enlightenment, that great eruption of European philosophical confidence in reason, in individual rights, in the idea that human beings were not simply instruments of state or divine will, but persons with inherent dignity, turned its attention among many other things to marriage. The philosophers and writers of the 1700s began asking questions that the medieval world had not asked out loud, at least not in public. Why should a woman's choice of husband be entirely in someone else's hands? What kind of society does that produce? What does it do to the people inside it? In England, the Marriage Act of 1753 was a revealing moment. It required all marriages to take place in a church of the Church of England, banned the secret marriages that has seen a loophole for everything from romantic elopements to bigamy, and mandated that anyone under 21 had to have parental consent before marrying. Clergymen who married couples without following these rules faced 14 years of transportation to the colonies as punishment. The debates in Parliament over this act were ferocious. You might think from our vantage point that establishing a minimum age and requiring some basic legal framework would be uncontroversial, but it was anything but. The opponents argued that the act was an attack on the freedom of individuals to arrange their own lives. The proponents argued in turn that the existing chaos, secret marriages, underage marriages, marriages without any witnesses, was itself a form of exploitation, particularly of women and girls who had no protection from men who would promise marriage to obtain what they wanted and then disappear. What strikes me reading about these debates is how clearly the participants knew that what they were discussing was not just a legal technicality. They were arguing about who had the right to decide a woman's life. They were arguing in the language available to them in the 1700s about something we would now recognize as autonomy. The act passed. It was imperfect. It was immediately circumvented by couples who crossed the border into Scotland, where English law did not apply, and got married at Gretna Green by the village blacksmith. But the principle had been stated. The state had for the first time said explicitly there is a minimum floor below which marriage cannot go, and parental coercion of children into marriage is not a protected right. It was a crack in the wall, not a revolution, but a crack, and then came something that genuinely was a revolution. In 1789, the streets of Paris filled with people who had decided with extraordinary force and at terrible cost that the old arrangements were done. That sovereignty did not live in a bloodline. That authority did not descend from God through a king to his subjects. That the people, the actual people, not their hereditary rulers, were the source of legitimate power. The French Revolution changed everything, including and perhaps especially marriage. In 1791, the Revolutionary National Assembly declared marriage a civil contract, not a sacrament, Not a religious event, but a legal agreement between two people. The church no longer had primary jurisdiction over it. The state did. And in 1792, France, for a brief extraordinary period, before it was partially reversed under Napoleon, legalized divorce, not just in theory, practically. Men and women could dissolve marriages that were not working. Unhappiness alone was a valid reason to seek a divorce. The idea that a woman could be permanently bound to a man who treated her badly with no legal recourse was no longer the universal assumption of French law. The theorists of the Revolution went further. Writers and thinkers argued that the prevalence of unhappy marriages in the old society was itself a product of arranged marriage, that when people were forced into unions they had not chosen, faithlessness was the natural result. The remedy was obvious: let people choose, let the consent be real, let the choice be made by the individuals whose lives would be lived inside it. These ideas were electric. They travelled across Europe in pamphlets and newspapers and private correspondence. They were argued over in salons and debated in newly constituted parliaments. They were not immediately or uniformly adopted. Napoleon, who took power after the Revolution, was deeply ambivalent about women's autonomy. His civil code of 1804 gave women significantly fewer legal rights than the revolutionary period had briefly granted them, but the ideas themselves could not be unthought. The question had been asked in public loudly. It could not be quietly unanswered. Meanwhile, at the level of royal families, the level that is specifically our subject, something interesting was happening too, and it played out most vividly in one remarkable woman's story. Queen Victoria came to the throne of England in 1837 at the age of 18. She was by any measure an unusual case, a young woman who actually held supreme power, rather than being married into its proximity. She did not need a husband for his title or his territory. She was the crown, which meant for the first time in centuries that a British royal bride got to choose. Not entirely freely, the Royal Marriages Act of 1772 still required all royal family members to have the monarch's consent for marriage, and Victoria's various advisers and family members had opinions and schemes about who she should marry. Her uncle Leopold of Belgium had been steering her toward his nephew Albert of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha for years. The match was not spontaneous, but Victoria met Albert. She spent time with him. She wrote in her diary in letters that have survived and been read by historians for nearly 2 centuries about what she felt when she looked at him. And what she felt was genuine, immediate, overwhelming. She described his eyes, his laugh, his character. She was not performing for an audience. She was a 20-year-old woman writing in private about a man she'd fallen in love with. And then she did something that no British monarch had done in recent memory. She proposed to him herself. Because she was the Queen, and he could not propose to her without breaching protocol, she took matters into her own hands. She asked. He said yes. They married in February of 1840, both 20 years old, both more or less genuinely in love. The public reaction was extraordinary. The British people who had watched their previous monarchs cycle through joyless arranged unions, unhappy infidelities, and undignified scandals looked at Victoria and Albert and saw something different. They saw what a royal marriage was supposed to look like in the story that the Enlightenment and the novel and the new sentimental culture of the 19th century had been telling people for decades. They saw a love match. Victoria and Albert had 9 children. They worked together. They were seen together constantly in a way that royal couples were not typically seen together. They presented to the public the image of a marriage that was also a genuine partnership, and people loved them for it. The monarchy, which had been deeply unpopular under Victoria's predecessors, recovered its public standing almost entirely on the basis of a queen and a consort who appeared to actually like each other. But here is the irony, and it is a significant one because Victoria's story is not as simple as it appears. Victoria herself, the woman who had chosen her own husband, who had championed the love match, who had become the symbol of what marriage could look like when the people inside it genuinely wanted to be there. Victoria spent the rest of her life arranging the marriages of her children and grandchildren in the most meticulous, interventionist, old-fashioned way imaginable. She had 42 grandchildren. She placed them on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Norway, and Spain. She decided who was suitable. She vetoed matches she disapproved of. She used the Royal Marriages Act of 1772 to ensure that no royal wedding happened without her blessing. One historian described her as running the most exclusive matchmaking operation in the world. She called it soft power. Her grandchildren called it privately something rather less complimentary. The devastating final chapter of Victoria's matchmaking was written in 1914, when her grandsons, the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia went to war with each other. The very cousins whose marriages Victoria had arranged to bind Europe together ended up commanding the armies that tore it apart. The family reunion that was supposed to guarantee peace produced the bloodiest conflict in human history up to that point. There is something painfully, almost beautifully ironic in that. The system that had always claimed to serve peace, that had justified the separation of daughters from their homes and the deployment of children as diplomatic instruments on the grounds that it kept kingdoms from fighting that system, in its last great flowering under the most famous royal matchmaker of the modern era, helped light the fuse for the war that ended it. By the time the guns stopped in 1918, 4 of the great royal dynasties that had been running this marriage system for centuries had been swept away. The German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire all gone. The kings and emperors and tsars who'd been trading daughters back and forth across borders for 1,000 years, building alliances and securing peace through the bodies of their female descendants, most of them no longer had thrones to protect. What replaced them? Nation-states, democracies or attempts at democracy, governments that derived authority from elections rather than bloodlines. And in those new political systems, the idea of a daughter as a diplomatic instrument, as a treaty, made flesh had simply no place. There was nothing to make her an instrument of. The old machinery had nothing left to run. And so the system that had produced everything we've been exploring in this series, the child brides, and the dowry negotiations, and the handover ceremonies, and the journeys across borders, and the letters home, asking about the garden, that system slowly but genuinely ended. Not entirely, not everywhere, not without leaving traces that are visible in the world today. But as a primary mechanism of European governance, as the engine of continental diplomacy, as the structure that determined what happened to daughters of royal blood, it ended, which leaves us with one final question. And it is not a historical question, it is a present tense question about what all of this history means for us, the people watching from a world where 20-year-old queens propose to their own husbands, where minimum ages for marriage are written into law, where the idea of sending a 6-year-old across a border to become someone's wife is not just illegal, but essentially unimaginable. What did this history cost, and what did it buy us? That is what we are going to sit with in the last part of this story. Stay with me. We've travelled a long way together, from a 6-year-old girl in a blue dress being carried across a room, through border ceremonies where identity was stripped away piece by piece, through labour rooms and letters and stone crosses built in grief, through women who fought women who survived women who reshaped the world around them with nothing but their own extraordinary resilience. And now at the end of it all, I want to bring you to one more moment. One more girl standing at the edge of a life she did not entirely understand. The date is July 29th, 1981. The place is St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and inside a carriage with an ivory silk dress so wide it barely fit through the door, a 20-year-old woman named Diana Spencer is about to walk down the longest aisle in British history, watched live by 750 million people around the world. 750 million. Let that number sit for a moment. That is roughly 1 in 5 human beings on the planet at the time gathered around television sets and radios from London to Tokyo to Buenos Aires, watching a young woman walk toward a man she had met 13 times. She'd met him 13 times before the proposal. Here is what strikes me when I look at Diana's story through the lens of everything we've covered in this series. She is not Isabella of Valois. She is not Catherine of Aragon. She is not anyone's diplomatic instrument. In the old sense, there were no kingdoms at stake, no peace treaties embedded in her vows, no alliances that depended on whether she produced a male heir in the first year of marriage. The year was 1981. The world had changed enormously from the medieval court where young queens were handed across rivers on islands in the Rhine, and yet Diana was chosen in part because she was young and relatively inexperienced. Those were presented as qualities, not concerns. A young woman would be malleable, the thinking went, unformed enough to adapt to what the institution required. She had no complicated past, no established opinions that might complicate her new role. She was in the language of the advisors and courtiers and newspaper columnists who analysed her suitability a blank page. That phrase again, the same phrase. Across 700 years of history, the system had changed enormously. The machinery was different, the vocabulary was different, the legal architecture was entirely different. Diana was not a child, she was not transported against her will, she was not the subject of a treaty signed when she was 3 years old. She said yes. She wanted to say yes by most accounts, at least at the beginning. But the underlying logic that a young woman's lack of experience was a feature rather than a problem, that the institution needed someone who could be shaped, rather than someone who already knew who she was, that logic had not entirely disappeared. It had just dressed itself in different clothes. By the time she was 21, Diana had been Princess of Wales for 11 months. Her face had not left the tabloids. She was separated from her friends and family. She had a newborn son, an eating disorder, and the first signs of a depression that would shadow her for years. She described the early months of her marriage as the loneliest of her life. She had moved into Buckingham Palace just before the wedding, and she later said the palace felt like a trap, opulent, enormous, and utterly isolating. She walked into a gilded cage. She said so herself in her own words in the 1995 BBC Panorama interview that shocked the world. And the world was shocked partly because she said it because royal women were not supposed to say it, but also I think because somewhere in the collective understanding people already knew it was true, had always known on some level that this was not entirely different from what had always been asked of women in her position. The script had been updated. The costumes were modern, but some of the oldest lines were still in the show. I do not want to end this series in a place of pure sadness. That would be dishonest, and it would miss something important about what all of these women's lives actually mean. Because here is the other truth, the one that runs alongside the harder one. Diana changed things. Not alone and not completely, but genuinely. She was the first British royal bride to refuse the word obey, in her wedding vows, a small moment in the ceremony that caused, as the newspapers reported, some comment at the time. She was the first person in the modern royal family to speak publicly about the psychological cost of the institution. She was the first royal to bring the conversation about mental health, about eating disorders, about the human price of public life into the open. She was the first to sit with dying people, to hold the hands of children in hospital, to make the monarchy feel like it was actually about something that mattered. And she was the last, by most accounts, to enter the British royal family as a very young woman, chosen partly because her youth seemed like an advantage. After Diana, the people who married into the British crown came older, more formed, more themselves. They came with careers and friends and opinions. They came knowing who they were before they arrived. The institution, battered and forced to reckon with itself in ways it had avoided for centuries, began slowly, unevenly, not without resistance, to adapt. Prince William met his wife Catherine at university. He was in his 20s. She was in her 20s. They dated for years. They broke up and got back together. They were two fully formed adults who chose each other with the benefit of actual knowledge of who the other person was. Their wedding in 2011 was watched by almost as many people as Diana's. But the feeling was different. The anxiety about whether she was ready, whether she understood what she was walking into, whether the institution was making the same terrible mistake, that anxiety was largely absent. Because she was not 20. She was not inexperienced. She was not a blank page. That is not nothing. That is in fact the accumulated weight of a very long argument finally winning. So what do we take from all of this? All these women, all these stories, all these centuries, I've been thinking about that question throughout this entire series, and the answer I keep arriving at is not a clean one. History rarely offers clean answers, but there is something in these stories that I think is worth naming clearly because I believe it matters. Every generation inherits a system. The system says this is how things work. This is what marriage is for. This is who a woman is and what she owes, and how she should be used. The system is confident. The system has been around for centuries. The system has the weight of precedent and tradition, and the deeply human tendency to assume that what has always been done must be what should be done. And into that system in every generation come individual people. Women who are 6 years old with dolls. Women who are 13 and pregnant and terrified. Women who are brilliant and prepared and still lost everything. Women who are placed at the edge of a river and stripped of everything they had known and sent to be someone else on the other side. Women who fought back, who outlasted their oppressors, who bent the rules with such skill that nobody realized until much later what they had actually done. Women who wrote books nobody listened to in their lifetime. Women who died in labor at 14. Women who stood in church at 20 and refused to say the word obey. Every one of them was a person. Every one of them had an inner life as complex and full and real as yours or mine, and the system, almost without exception, was built to treat that inner life as irrelevant. What changed it? Not one thing, not one person, not one moment. It was the accumulation, the slow, grinding pressure of generation after generation of women who refused to entirely disappear inside their assigned roles. Who wrote the letters home asking about the garden? Who learned the languages of foreign courts and then used those languages to argue for themselves? Who gave birth in foreign castles and named their babies what they chose to name them? Who fell off donkeys and laughed, even when someone was waiting to ask what the protocol was? Who said quietly or loudly in ways that were heard immediately or not heard for centuries, "I am a person. I am here. You cannot fully erase me no matter how hard the system tries." That is the real story of the royal brides, not the treaties, not the dowries, not the dynasties, but the stubborn, persistent, sometimes agonizing humanity of the women at the center of it all. Women who were handed to systems that wanted to reduce them to instruments, and who refused in their various ways to be only that. Here is something I want to leave you with because I think it earns a place at the very end of this long journey. Isabella of Valois, the 6-year-old in the blue dress who opened this series, never became the queen she was sent to England to be. Her husband was overthrown. Her marriage, which was never consummated, ended by default. She went back to France. She was married again to a second husband at 16. She had a daughter. She died in labour at 19. Her daughter survived. Joan of Valois grew up married, had children of her own. Generations grew from her. Lives spread outward in every direction, from the girl who had a mother who was carried across a room at age 6 with a doll in her arms. That is what this system produced too. Not just grief, lives, generations. The tangled, unbroken thread of human continuation, carried forward against every odd, by women who were asked to give everything, and who gave it, and who deserve to be remembered, not only for what was done to them, but for what they did with what they were given. I'm genuinely grateful that you've been here for this entire journey. 12 parts is a long time to spend in the company of history's most extraordinary, most overlooked, most quietly extraordinary women. And I hope that the next time you encounter a casual mention of royal marriages in a history book or a documentary, some part of you will pause and remember that each one of those marriages was a person, with a name, with a life, with a dog that was taken from her arms at a border crossing and given back to the other side. They mattered. Every single one of them mattered. And now, before you drift off tonight, I want to ask you one thing. Drop a comment and tell me which of these women stayed with you the most. Which story caught you somewhere you didn't expect. I genuinely want to know. Because this series ends here, but this conversation, the one about who gets to own their own story, and what it costs to fight for that, right, that conversation is not finished. Not yet. The next story we are going to tell is one that I think will surprise you. Different time, different world, different women, but the same stubborn thread of humanity running through it. And when it begins, I want you to be here. So rest well tonight. You have been keeping good company.